Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shayna Strom, and I'm the President and CEO of the Washington.
think there's 4 right here, but I just took one. Okay, so they just.
Hey, hey. 1, 2. Yep. Hey, hey. Hey, hey. 1, 2. Yep. All right. Yeah. You see that knob there on the top? That's good. Hey, hey. That's good. Thank you. Hey, hey. 1, 2.
Okay, I think you're here. Okay, I'm going to put video on, but I need you to sit down.
Testing. All right, great.
With the camera, can't we get your face up there?
We're hearing them now, at least.
Hi, Connie. You should be able to hear me.
Yes, I'm trying to get Sherrod in. He's using my computer, but I can't seem to get, when I select FaceTime HD camera, it's not coming on. What should I be doing here? Good. Let me see video setting.
Sherrod, are you on the line?
He's here.
I'm with Connie. I'm standing over her because she's better at this.
Oh, there we are. I got to get out of here.
Okay, so let's just hang out until we're ready for him to go on. We're getting folks into the room. It's going to be a few more minutes.
Yep. Well, I don't see her. I just see me on there.
Sherrod, we see you. You're not going to see us, okay?
Okay.
It's working.
All right, got it.
Please find your seats. We are going to get started momentarily. All right, folks, we are ready to get started. Welcome, everyone. All right, we're ready to get started. Welcome. We are so glad you've joined us for today's event. I'm Melissa Grover-Morrow, Vice President of Impact and Special Initiatives at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I'm going to get some housekeeping out of the way first. So lunch is in the adjacent room. Make sure that you get your drinks and your food as you need to. And we do have a packed agenda today, so and a relatively short time together. So make sure that you get up when you need to. Restrooms are downstairs. There are signs guiding you as needed. For those of you who are new to Washington Center for Equitable Growth, we bridge economic evidence and policy to promote ideas around shared prosperity and growth in the US. We do this by funding research, elevating academic voices in the policy world, and translating academic evidence for policymakers. Much empirical work has been done by academics on populism in the US and abroad. We are hosting this event today to bring the empirical evidence from multiple disciplines together and ensure that the evidence is used to shape future economic policy in ways that strengthen democracy. Today's event also serves as our official launch of an essay series we published on the causes of rising support for populism and potential solutions aimed at strengthening democracy. Many of the essay authors are with us today, and you'll be here. President and CEO Shana Strom.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shana Strom, and I'm the President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I'm sorry I'm not here with you in person for this important event today, but I'm so excited for our great lineup of programming and for the opportunity for discussion. Around the globe, people are increasingly dissatisfied with politics and the economy. In the United States and other rich democracies, economic policy has in recent decades too often produced rising economic inequality, stagnant economic growth and innovation, rising costs of housing, healthcare, and education, greater economic insecurity, and declining job quality and stability. Voters have communicated their frustration with a surge of support for populist parties, politicians, and political causes that challenge incumbent elites and profess to speak directly to the needs of real people. In most cases to date, voters have gravitated to populism's right-wing or authoritarian variants. There has been, and will continue to be, a lot of punditry about the 2024 US presidential election in particular and what it means. What Equitable Growth is trying to do is what we do best: bring academic evidence to bear on important policy conversations. We hope to draw on learnings from other countries as well as the US and use concrete evidence to chart a better path forward, one that leads to equitable economic growth that people can feel and that gives them hope for the future. Our specific goal in this event, this essay series, and other essays on this topic that we will publish in the future, is to explore the implications of right-wing populism for those making and following US economic policy. In our discussions today, we will lay out the case for why policymakers should approach economic policy with an eye to its political effects on democracy, as well as exploring what this approach could look like across different policy areas. We believe that the turn towards authoritarian populism in the United States not only threatens democratic institutions and systems, but also puts Americans' economic well-being at risk. Economic policy can work to counteract this trend and bolster US democracy, but is less likely to do so as it has traditionally been developed. At a time when the broader policy community is still debating the implications of the 2024 presidential election results and the extent to which it was a referendum on former President Joe Biden's economic policies, we hope that this event and essay series will broaden the debate about the future of economic policy and politics in the United States at a moment of democratic crisis. Enjoy the event today, and I look forward to being part of the discussions and debates that follow.
Wish her well on her leave. I'd now like to introduce Alexander Hurdle Fernandez. Alex is an associate professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University, where he serves as vice dean and is also a visiting fellow with Equitable Growth. Alex is a co-director of the Columbia Labor Lab, which uses social science to study worker power, and a co-lead of the Consortium on the American Political Economy. During the Biden and Harris administration, he served in the U.S. Department of Labor and the White House Office of Management and Budget. His research focuses on the politics of markets, policy design, and labor and the workplace. And Alex has worked side by side with me in designing today's event and providing vision and support for the essay series. Alex?
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thanks so much to all of you for coming out on a rainy day to listen to the fantastic set of ideas and essays that we're launching here. It's been a real privilege to be able to work together with Melissa and the EG team over the past 6 months to solicit and edit such a great set of ideas and essays from political scientists and economists and sociologists that, as Shana mentioned, really tries to lay out the case for why economic policy needs to take democracy seriously and can't just focus on economic outcomes. We're really excited to share 9 of those essays with you today, and you'll see on your table a QR code that you can scan to download those essays, and I encourage you to do it after the event today or in some downtime. As Shana mentioned, these essays really take a variety of forms. Some of them focus on diagnosing the drivers of right-wing populism and thinking about how different economic policy choices have increased the appeal of right-wing populism in the US and other countries, and others propose new policy ideas that could be used to diffuse or defang the appeal of right-wing populism. And you'll hear about some of those today, whether it's new ways to measure economic sentiment, new ways to organize grassroots constituencies so that they see the role of government in their lives, or new ways to invest in places that can really reinforce senses of community and belonging. In addition, Shana and I released an introductory essay for this project that reviews our overall goals, reviews the existing state of the literature on economic policy and right-wing populism, and comes up with a framework for how policymakers going forward might think about applying these concepts to their own work. And I wanted to share 3 of the moves that we try and make in that introductory essay that I hope resonate through the panels today. First, and most importantly, we argue that the surge in support for right-wing populism here in the United States and around the world needs to be taken seriously by thinkers and doers in the economic policy space. This isn't just a political problem for pundits and strategists, but one that economic policy needs to grapple with. Second, we argue that to do that will require drawing on a broader set of disciplines in social science than have traditionally been applied to economic policy. They're not just economics, although we have some fantastic pieces from economists in our series, but also thinking about political scientists and sociologists who have been thinking about this. And the last move that we stress that policymakers and others should undertake is thinking about putting the US in a comparative context. Far too often, we think about the ways that the US is exceptional from other countries, and in many cases it is, but thinking about right-wing populism orients us to the ways that this has really been a shift around the globe across many rich democracies. And as we think about the causes, consequences, and ways to defang right-wing populism, we really need to be focusing on that comparative context. So building on those insights and the great essays that we've commissioned, Shana and I propose new criteria for making economic policy. That policy needs to take seriously people's lived experiences of the economy, that it needs to take seriously people's identities, their sense of narratives about their lives, especially around dignity and status, place and community, and needs to show clearly how government is responding in real time to people's perceived social and economic needs. So I encourage you to check out the introductory essay and the fantastic essays that have been released today and will be released in the coming months. Now, to help frame this discussion, we are so fortunate to have two leaders who have, for many years, been thinking about how economic policy can support democracy in the workplace and in politics. They're also two personal heroes of mine, so it's a real treat to be able to introduce them and be in conversation with them. First, we'll hear from the Honorable Sherrod Brown, a former Democratic US Senator from Ohio. Brown spent his life fighting for the dignity of work, which, as we'll discuss, is a key factor in understanding how to diffuse the appeal of right-wing populism. And the Honorable Sherrod Brown, over this lifetime of public service, has very much focused on these questions. In March of this year, he launched the Dignity of Work Institute, an organization dedicated to people who make this country work and to creating an economy where Americans' work is valued. Next, we'll be in conversation with Sarah Nelson, who is the International President of the Association of Flight Attendants, a role that she's held since 2014. As International President, Nelson has led the association through some of its most important wins, including relief during the COVID pandemic that kept aviation workers connected to their jobs, while also capping executive compensation during the crisis. Nelson has also been a leading voice within the labor movement calling for large-scale organizing, especially of young people, and of gender equity in the workplace and in unions. And very relevant to this project, she's also thought and written trenchantly about the relationship between unions and democracy. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speakers, starting with former Senator Sherrod Brown.
Thank you. Alex, thank you for your kind words. It was good seeing you with Freedom Together a few weeks ago. My longtime friend, Sarah Nelson, thank you for standing up and speaking out the way you do. Melissa, thank you too for joining us. I'll start with this. I don't see populism as a dirty word. I see it as the way forward. When I talk about populism, as I think probably all of you in the audience do, I mean real populism. True populism lifts people up, all people. It doesn't play to race. It doesn't play to division. It doesn't tear people down. A true populism in the most affirming forward way is about the dignity of work, putting workers at the center, listening to workers. If you actually listen to workers, what's happening isn't really that complicated or mysterious. We have an economy today that does not reward work, that does not value the work of Americans without four-year college degrees, and in many cases doesn't value the work of Americans with four-year college degrees, where people can't keep up with the cost of living no matter how hard they work. Over the past 40 years, corporate profits have soared, executive salaries have exploded, stock buybacks, bonuses, productivity keeps going up, yet wages are largely flat. The cost of living keeps getting more expensive. Productivity and wages through the 60s and 70s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s, productivity and wages used to rise together. That began to change in the late 70s. Since then, workers produce more and more, but they enjoy a smaller and smaller share of the wealth they create. Cost of living just keeps going up. People don't have enough money coming in the door. They have too much money going out the door. And be clear, a couple of years of modestly rising wages are not going to make up for decades of Americans working harder than ever and less to show for it. Let me tell a story that I was at an AFL-CIO dinner in Cincinnati some years ago, and as politicians do, I was walking around table to table talking to people, and there was a table near the front, 6 middle-aged women, and there's an empty chair, and one of them said, "Sit down for a second." And I said, "What brings you here?" And they said, "We negotiated our first contract today, union contract." I said, "What was it?" She said, "We represent 1,200 custodial workers." She was kinder than the way I'm going to say it. Essentially, they work all night at low wages to clean the offices so people like me can come into work the next day. And I said, what's this contract, first contract we've had for these 1,200 workers? What's this contract mean to you? And she said, this is the first time in my life. I'm 51 years old. This is the first time in my life I'll have a paid 1 week vacation. Most people in Ohio, certainly people like her, but most people in Ohio believe the system's rigged against them. And they're right. I trace a lot of this back to NAFTA. The attitudes on display there have infected so much thinking about the economy in Washington. It was my first year in Congress in 1993. I led the opposition among the 60 Democrats in the freshman class. I was talking to Bill Richardson, a veteran Democrat at that time, part of leadership, who was one of the leaders in the support for NAFTA movement in Congress. And he said to me, he said, Brownie, nobody called me Brownie, but him. He said, Brownie, I hate these congressional recesses because every time our members go home, they come back more opposed to NAFTA. And I said, yeah, there's a reason for that. People don't like this direction that you want to go in. Today in the Mahoning Valley, Youngstown, Warren, Eastern Ohio, not far from Pittsburgh, not far from where the train derailed, the Norfolk Southern train derailed. I still hear about NAFTA. There was and still is a visceral sense of betrayal that the party of Roosevelt had sold out their communities. I understand Republicans, Bush negotiated, Republicans voted for it in larger numbers than Democrats, but they expected better from Democrats who talk about workers and talk about what we need to do. And I was during this NAFTA fight, I learned a lot about where this country is going and where workers, how underrepresented workers are during that debate many years ago. But I remember someone told me there were more corporate jets at National Airport during the week of the NAFTA vote than they had ever seen. That should tell us something too. They then, the Wall Street, the free traders in Congress and the business community, meaning most of them, they followed up NAFTA with something with normalizing trade relations with China. They fairly unbelievably, they initially called it most favored nation status with China. They realized that didn't quite work, so they changed the name. But there was little debate among the supposed serious economists. If you point out that a flood of Chinese imports would cost us manufacturing jobs, and understand what this was. It's companies in places like I grew up, Mansfield, Ohio, an industrial town where I went to school with hundreds of sons and daughters of steelworkers and auto workers and millwrights and iron workers and bricklayers and electrical workers. And those companies started to move south to anti-union states and always in search of lower wages. And then they came to Congress and pushed for these trade agreements, understanding shut down production in Lima or Shelby, Ohio, move to China, pay much lower, always in search of lower wages, pay lower wages, weaker environmental laws, fewer worker protections. So that's how we got to where they were. But when you point out that a flood of Chinese imports would cost us manufacturing jobs, they'd say the labor market, I remember this word, it will adjust, whatever that means. Talk to anyone in a manufacturing town in the Midwest or elsewhere. They'll tell you this was lunacy. Of course, people lost faith in the party. They probably lost faith in populism and progressivism, and they lost faith in their government. They feel gaslit. They feel condescended to. Leaders in both parties said these deals would lift everyone up, and they looked down on anyone who disagreed. I remember campaigning with one national Democrat near Cleveland. In between events, the conversation turned to trade, and he said, Jared, you're fighting the last war. And I also heard comments like, you're on the wrong side of history. Anytime you raised a concern about workers, they'd say, don't worry, we'll compensate the losers. That was a term, that some activists will say that TAA, trade adjustment assistance, is sort of is burial expenses. I mean, that's what people that were so opposed to these trade agreements thought. They seem to have no awareness. The pushers of these trade agreements seem to have no awareness of how insulting all this sounded. As if any amount of compensation could replace the dignity you get from a good paying middle class job with the skills you're proud of. You make things, you build things, you keep these plants going because of your skills as a bricklayer or a millwright or an electrician or a plumber or a pipe fitter. They the leaders of both parties have missed this, not just on trade, but on the entire project that often gets called neoliberalism. We've allowed the financial industry, we've allowed multinational corporations to run wild. Essentially, we've let Wall Street run this economy, the financialization of the economy. Progressive response has largely been, we'll just try to do enough to redistribution and taxes and spending to make up for the way it hurts workers. We weren't able to do that, of course, not even close. But beyond that, the solution is unpopular, and frankly, it's insulting to workers. Too often, people in Washington end up sounding like they think workers in the heartland are charity cases. But most people don't want what they view as government handouts, nor do they want to be left to fend for themselves in an unfair market rigged, that word again, rigged by multinational corporations that benefits people at the top. They want a level playing field so their hard work can actually pay off, so they can afford a decent life. That brings me to what Alex said, the Dignity of Work Institute. Early this year, a group of us that used to work in my office and supporters and people in the labor movement and others launched the Dignity of Work Institute in Ohio. It's a national organization. It'll be headquartered in Ohio. It's nonpartisan, it's nonprofit, it's dedicated to create an economy where workers benefit from the wealth they create. They share in the wealth they create. It's actually making workers the winners in our economy. Research will be a big part of this work. We began with a national survey asking Americans about their jobs and their lives. Not a political discussion, but a worker-centered discussion, how they view success and the barriers they see to getting ahead. We followed that up with national focus groups with a broad cross-section of the country. You'll be hearing more about this soon. From all of this, it's so clear that the way people in Washington measure and talk about the economy is just wrong-headed. It's fundamentally flawed. It doesn't reflect the reality of workers' lives. President after president in both parties tout how great the economy is. They cite the unemployment rate, they cite the inflation rate, they cite the stock market, but those statistics don't come close to telling the whole story. Working multiple jobs is a way of life for a lot of workers. It's how low workers' expectations have gotten about the economy. 1 in 4 workers have worked more than one job in the last 2 years. So the unemployment rate hardly tells that story. In every focus group, people talked about driving Uber or Lyft or doing Instacart, not necessarily even in a negative way. They see it as a safety net to keep up with costs. Again, more money going out than money coming in. Fewer than half of Americans, get this, fewer than half of Americans say they could deal with fairly comfortably an unexpected $1,000 increase. That's replacing 4 tires on your car, the car you need to get to work or to do work. And that could be an unexpected expense that workers just would have great difficulty dealing with. A low unemployment rate or inflation rate coming down doesn't mean nearly as much to people as people in Washington want to believe if Americans have to work 2 jobs to afford to live. One project we're undertaking is pushing progressives like all of you to come up with new, better ways to measure the economy. We can't make the mistake again of cheerleading for an economy that people rightly think is failing. People want fundamental change. This may have been the most interesting information of the survey. We asked people on a ladder, 1 to 10, which rung are you on? If it's 1, if you pick 1, you're satisfied with the economy, things are working. 10, you want to blow everything up and tear it all down and start again. Overall, half said 8, 9, or 10. And a third said 10 out of 10. That's why Trump's destruction with the way he does things is appealing to a lot of people in this country. Workers keep telling us the status quo isn't working for them. That was clear last year. It's why we got the election results we did. Workers wanted change in 16. They voted for change. Workers wanted change in 20. They voted for change. Workers wanted change in 24. They wanted change. I know a lot of people in this room were involved in the Biden administration. High hopes for what they could deliver. But for all the legislating and policy making over the last 4 years, Americans didn't see this administration as a break from the status quo. They saw the White House and progressives as defenders of institutions that people believe fundamentally have failed them. And they're not wrong. That's so clear with inflation. To people in Ohio, it seemed the White House was oblivious to what they were seeing in their own lives, or worse, trying to deny the very real price increases that were killing them every time they went to the grocery store. Connie and I, after church, would often stop in a grocery store nearby, and we would hear people at the checkout counter, in the aisles, at the meat counter, a checkout line, the meat counter, in the aisle, grocery store aisles, talking about inflation, and they weren't really buying, oh, it's higher in other countries. They weren't really buying that it's coming down. They didn't buy the term transitory. I mean, who comes up with lines like that? It's the same kind of tone deafness people in Ohio heard for years on trade. It's the mentality of, we in Washington know better. You just don't understand how great it is what we're doing. People essentially wanted a wrecking ball to the system. Trump is a wrecking ball, but he's not wrecking the things that stand in the way of progress for workers. People think it's so clear what people think. They think the economy is getting worse, not better. They think costs are going up, not down. They're worried about tariffs, which are giving tariffs a bad name. They can be done right and giving new life to the old corporate trade. It's not either Trump's way of doing tariffs or going back to the neoliberal way that we've practiced trade in this country, because that surely didn't work. So people are looking around and saying, when's my life going to start getting better? Where's the wrecking ball for corporate interests that still raise prices? Where's the wrecking ball for Wall Street or the drug companies that built system that reward CEOs instead of workers? They think that right now, neither party has an agenda to create the dramatic change workers want. Fundamentally, they're not wrong about that either. This is a project the progressive movement has to undertake if it wants to include workers without college degrees, workers who didn't go to fancy schools, workers who don't live, and no offense intended here, but workers who don't live in Washington or New York or San Francisco. We have to start with listening. That's why at our institute, we're not starting with a series of policy prescriptions. I know what I think, but I want to know what workers think. We're hearing directly from workers in polling and focus groups and roundtables and discussions about their lives and the economy they want to see and how to get there. We need to make workers the winners in our economy. That's what my mission is. It's what the Dignity of Work Institute is all about. It's what the progressive movement needs to fully commit to, fundamentally, that workers share in the wealth they create. Thank you so much for having me.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Nelson. I am the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, and I do think that it's important. First of all, it's an honor to speak after Sherrod. He's been very clear with me that he will never speak after me again. But he's set the scene perfectly. But I do think it's important to also set the scene from the perspective that I'm going to bring to you, because I never, ever imagined that I would be in a room like this. My brother definitely wanted to go into politics, and he spent time when we were growing up at Boys State, and they would sit around and talk about how none of them were ever going to inhale because that might be a problem, and and wholly focused on also going to UVA Law School because he wanted the Kennedy tradition. And I didn't think that I had any interest in any of that. I just wanted to have a really good time. And so I was going to be a high school English teacher. And as I was planning to set up my classroom and staring down student debts and trying to think about how I was going to make it on a first-year teacher's salary, a friend of mine who had become a flight attendant called me. And she called me on a very snowy day in St. Louis where I was. And she called me with her feet in the sand in Miami Beach, first giving me a hard time about that, and then going on to say, this job is actually no joke. And she explained the contract that had been negotiated since 1946, when the first flight attendants organized at United Airlines first, and built it up at that point over close to 60 years of bargaining. And It was going to be higher pay than my first year as a teacher. There would be more flexibility. There was going to be healthcare that was actually good for women because it was negotiated by women. And there would be a pension that I could take at age 50. And so working 4 jobs at 23 and trying to figure out how I was going to get by, I hightailed it to Chicago the next day and interviewed with United Airlines and became a flight attendant, and immediately out of training, the company failed to pay me. I found out what it was like to be a number in an HR file, and it wasn't until a fellow union member tapped me on the shoulder, offered me an $800 check and said, number 1, you go take care of yourself, and number 2, you call our union. And so I got involved, and 5 years later, September 11th happened. And we're 80% organized in the airline industry. So we have, as you can see on the chart here, and actually, could we have the other chart up about union density first? So as you'll see on the chart, in 1979, the airline industry deregulated, and you can see that on here. And you can see also from about 57 to 1980, that is the result of Taft-Hartley, starting to take away the rights of union members and pushing right to work in different states, so declining that union membership. But when I started flying, it was on the backs of Ronald Reagan firing the air traffic controllers in 1981 and making it very clear that it was open season on unions. And so you can see the line just dropped straight down from there. As the strike was made a dirty word, there was already the chamber and the business community were all attacking unions, but now you had it coming from the President of the United States. At the same time that our financial system was overhauled, and we allowed things like stock buybacks and allowed tax cuts to the top 10%, while we're leaving the rest of everyone behind, and more there's less of a check in corporate greed. So this was already starting to happen in a lot of other industries, but on September 11th, 2001, I was a 5-year flight attendant flying out of Boston. And everything changed that day. Flight 175 that you can picture flying into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, and you can picture it because all cameras were trained on that site because American Flight 11 had hit the North Tower 17 minutes earlier. On Flight 175 that I had flown the week before and flew very often were my good friends. There were Amy and Michael and another Amy, Robert, Al, Alicia, Catherine, Marianne, and Jesus. And I say their names almost every single day. We lost them that day. We were trying to work through our grief. We were dealing with immediate furloughs that meant in Boston, half of the base was furloughed immediately because we were quite junior. Many of the people were roommates with the people who had died. And we were trying to pick up the pieces, and what we didn't know was that there were crisis capitalists planning from that very moment to take advantage of this moment, to change the value, the market rate of a flight attendant, a pilot, a mechanic, a gate agent, to outsource the sky caps and the kitchens so that they could have these jobs with no benefits at all and at the lowest wages. And so I saw that upfront and personal, and was very involved during the 38-month-long bankruptcy at United Airlines, but there were bankruptcies across the industry to do this. And as pay was cut, people agreed to work longer days. So you can see right away, as union density was declining here, income inequality goes up at almost the exact same rate. If we move over to the productivity chart, as people were making less money, there were fewer jobs available, people were willing to work for less because they still had to pay their rent, their mortgage. They still had to take care of their families. They had to try to make it work. And the 8-hour day that we negotiated in our first flight attendant contract in 1946, that was on the backs of a fighting labor movement, fighting for that 8-hour day, was stripped away in that bankruptcy in the early 2000s. And that happened across the board. So as I was attending over the last 20 years, political events, and I would hear Democrats say, unions, the people who brought you the weekend and the 8-hour day, and they would go on to list all the things that union members and the working class have lost, actually, over the past 40 years with this assault on unions. Most people don't know what an 8-hour day looks like today. Most people don't have a weekend. Most people are working 2 and 3 jobs to try to get by. And in this case, the flight attendants and other airline workers agreed to get rid of some of those great work rules that made me drive to Chicago. And then they came for our pensions. And they came for our pensions in 2005, just on the heels of President Bush failing to privatize Social Security. And so it was open season on defined benefit pension plans then. I remember at the beginning of the bankruptcy talking about what could potentially happen. And the pilots said, oh, they're never going to come for the pensions because pensions are a sacred cow in this country. And all they had to do was work on dividing workers from each other, making workers feel like they're in competition with each other. If you have a pension, that's not fair. I don't have a pension, you shouldn't have one either. As opposed to the idea that an injury to one is an injury to all, and we should be lifting each other. A friend of mine talks about the metaphor of a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, those boats are turning more and more into yachts. And as we think about this in the kind of world that we need to build and the kind of solidarity that you need to have in democracy, we shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as the boats. We should be thinking of ourselves as the tide. And that tide can turn over yachts too. Just saying. So there's the 4 Ds of union busting: divide, delay, distract, and demoralize. And this has been the program that has depleted union membership, has kept people believing that they're in competition with each other. And since the beginning of time, the biggest tools of the boss for dividing and distracting and delaying any results and demoralizing is racism and sexism. When I think about my union that was built up by women, I know that we had to fight through incredible discriminatory practices to turn this job into a career. You didn't used to be able to be married or have children. We had to step on a weight scale until 1993. And when I interviewed a flight attendant who had started in the 1940s, and she was one of our first union representatives, and she actually went all over the world and was successful in getting the evacuation signal as standard equipment on all aircraft everywhere. She's quite a go-getter. But she said to me, Sarah, you know, I am personally opposed to abortion. But she said, one of the things that I had to do most often as a union representative was help women try to get a safe abortion, because they were going to lose their freedom and their ability to have any say in what this world looks like, have any autonomy at all, because they had been raped on a layover, or they had had a boyfriend and gotten pregnant. And they were going to have to go back home to where they were already in an abusive situation, where people just wanted them to be baby makers and homemakers. And so it's very important that we take in the fact that social justice is directly tied to economic justice. So as this productivity has increased at almost the exact rate that the inequality has increased in this country and union membership has gone down, wages have remained relatively stagnant. And if you know, now they're trying to divide us by political ideology. They've always tried to divide us by class too. And there's a lot of, why do workers vote against their own self-interest? Well, if you look at this chart, have workers been voting against their own self-interest? Not a single election got better for them. Every single one got worse. It's really important to take that in. It's really important to take in the fact that we need very simple solutions. After going through the crisis of the bankruptcy and somehow haphazardly becoming president of our union, strong sense of justice and a loud mouth will carry you very far, by the way. I had to figure out how we were going to build back. We are in a round of bargaining right now that is the first round of bargaining since 9/11 where we actually have the opportunity to address the issues in the workplace today that people care about and try to make headway 20 years later. So when we hit the crisis of COVID, we were not about to allow this crisis to be used against us again. We had learned that lesson. And as I had been out too, working with other workers, I understood more and more that I couldn't be the president of the flight attendant union without standing up for other workers, without understanding their issues. I remember standing out on the GM picket line in 2019 and hearing some of the same complaints that I heard from flight attendants the day before in a flight attendant union meeting. They might have been called something slightly different, but there were tiers of employment where some workers are defined as more valuable than others and make a different set of pay and benefits. And there were people who were being forced to work overtime. There were people who had no control over their schedules. There were people who had lost their pensions. They had lost any ability to have that retirement security. And during this same time, there's been an attack on our federal programs too. It's about breaking everything and making sure that it doesn't work. So it's been about trying to break the post office, and so that people can't count on the delivery of mail. And so we should just privatize it because privatizing will solve everything. During the 2019 government shutdown, this became very apparent to me as there was no political solution in sight, and the shutdown had gone on twice as long as any other government shutdown. And supposedly it was about a southern border wall and the racist fear-mongering that was going on along with that. That was the demand for opening the government again from the White House. And really, that was a distraction. That was another union-busting tactic. What we saw was this is about making government not work. This is about breaking federal workers. This is about pushing air traffic controllers to the brink so that they have to walk off the job. And so that there would be an argument to privatize everything. If there were an aircraft accident, power would accrue to the executive. If there was a terrorist event, power would accrue to the executive. And if nothing happened at all, they would say, see, we were right. It's just a big bureaucracy that we don't need. And so as I look at Project 2025, I just see a sped up version of what there has been attempted to be done over the last 50 years. To break everything, make it not work, never invest in the people, and continue to give tax breaks to the rich. So much so that then they're controlling our politics too. And we try to do little, simple, little tiny changes to these policies to try to make a difference for people, as opposed to being very bold and very clear about what needs to be done. During COVID, we said this is never going to happen again. So we needed simple solutions. And so we put forward a plan that was workers first. We said that the government should provide grants to the airlines that are a complete pass-through to workers. It continues to our paychecks, and the government doesn't have to become the HR solution for all the people who are out of work. It kept us connected to our healthcare, kept us getting contributions to our retirement, and it kept us paying state and local taxes that actually need to be there in order to support our public programs. And so we had hoped that this would be a program that would be used across the rest of the economy, but it wasn't. And the one thing that the airlines fought against, we actually negotiated outside of the political process to get them on the same page. The one thing they would not agree to was not using any federal dollars to union bust. They agreed to cap their pay. They agreed to ban stock buybacks. They would not agree to not spending any money on union busting, okay? Because they want to continue to keep that control. So this is the one check on corporate greed that we still have in this economy, and it is critically important that if we want to save this democracy, we have to give people the agency to have a union, to negotiate, to practice democracy in their workplace. This is the one place where they get to practice that. It's the one place where two parties have to come together, diametrically opposed, and must come together in an agreement. It's part of the reason that we don't have any agreement in Washington. Nobody knows how to do it anymore. There's no ability to do that anymore. So I'll just close by saying that this is still a crisis. Our government, our Congress, was willing to approve bills with trillions and trillions of dollars of investment in regular people. Now, the programs that they put in place didn't all work, as well as the Workers' First Plan that we got for aviation. It was the only industry not to grow in inequality during that time, because we put those controls on the executives, on the corporations, and we invested in the people on the ground. And so I just would really encourage all of you to, first of all, reject any of this narrative about people voting against themselves, because it's not true. They've not been given a fair shake. They have only seen the system be rigged more and more against them. It doesn't work at all. It doesn't create any equality, that's for sure. Women and people of color are going to experience worse and worse conditions if we don't have simple solutions that simply provide people with essentially what FDR was calling for in the Economic Bill of Rights. A decent home, a job with a living wage, health care, protection in the event of disability or old age, and an education without a death sentence. And so we've got to be talking about these very, very simple solutions that people can understand and understand are for them, building the economy from the ground up, rather than continuing to talk about tax breaks that no one in poverty or in lower income can even comprehend, because they don't have the money in the first place to pay those damn taxes. It's very expensive to be poor. So I encourage all of you, as you go out of this room, to reject the notion that people are voting against themselves, and to think about how we put forward bold policies, simple solutions, in a moment when we still have a crisis. We have a crisis not just of the existential threat of fascism. We have a crisis of a burning earth, and we have an economy to build up that can work for everyone. We can call people with the urgency of that crisis to build up in a way that makes sense to people, is simple, and doesn't have us fixing policies that are already broken. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Senator Brown. It's great to have you with us. I'd like to now invite Alex back up to the stage, as well as Jacob Hacker, for a fireside chat that Sarah will be part of as well. And since you haven't met Jacob yet, Jacob Hacker is Professor of Political Science, co-director of the Ludwig Program in Public Sector Leadership at Yale Law School, and director of the American Political Economy Exchange at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University. A regular policy advisor and expert commentator, Professor Hacker is known for his writings on health policy, especially his development of the so-called public option.
Does this work? Perfect. And thank you again, Sarah, for the great framing remarks and how how these issues have been refracted through your union, the industry that you've seen up close for so many years. And thank you, Jacob, for your great essay with Paul, which I encourage people to check out with Paul Pearson. And I'm excited for this conversation about some of the core issues that we're tackling in this project. So maybe starting with you first, Jacob, we've been talking about right-wing populism. That's been the impetus for this project. How would you define right-wing populism, and why should we care about its spread in the United States and around the world?
Thanks, Alex. And so first, let me say I believe in Sherrod Brown's rule that one should never speak after Sarah Nelson. So that, and second, I'm glad that we don't actually have a fire here. So I was a little worried about that. And I also want to just acknowledge that most of what I say is coming from my collaborative work with my longtime co-author and friend, Paul Pearson. So obviously, we know that right-wing populism is a global phenomenon, and it's also very much something that has been sweeping advanced industrial democracies. And it's linked up with the rise of the knowledge economy, changing social norms and diversity in these countries. And it's had these common elements that we now all know. It's anti-system. It is often driven by cultural or racial or anti-immigrant backlash. And it's, in most rich democracies, also welfare chauvinist, right? The idea of helping, the sons of the soil, the people who are the real citizens of this country, not those who are trying to appropriate their fair share. And it's clearly linked to the kind of trends that Sarah talked about. But I do think it's worth noting that American right-wing populism, which has essentially become the Republican Party, or vice versa, is pretty distinctive in two respects. One is that we have a political system that makes two parties, and only two parties, the norm. And it also is a system that creates very significant advantages, electoral advantages, for the party of non-metro America. Right? And since the non-metro divide is a huge divide in knowledge economies, and a big one in the United States, that, as Suzanne Mettler has written about, really has advantaged the Republican Party and driven its radicalization. The second thing is a phenomenon that Paul Pearson and I call plutocratic populism, namely the extent to which American right-wing populism has been very closely linked to this massive rise in inequality, particularly the pulling away of the super rich. And I sometimes think that we should be renaming it oligarchic populism in the current context. But I think that both these things make American right-wing populism much more dangerous for democracy. One is that the first can make it a minority pressures that can take over a mainstream party and then win elections despite not having strong popular majoritarian support. And the second is sort of this power of the economic elite supercharges American right-wing populism and drives it towards more unpopular policies that in turn call on the party to pursue even more anti-system ideas.
Great, thanks, Jacob. And I think a helpful perspective on how thinking about the comparative dimensions of populism are really important, but also as they're refracted through our political institutions that change its character in the US. So second question for both of you, maybe starting with you, Sarah. The core proposition of this project is that economic policy should focus on democracy, not just on economic outcomes. What would it look like to pursue an economic policy agenda for the working class that would focus on democracy?
Sharing is caring. Alex, thank you very much. So first of all, it's really important that people have the opportunity to practice democracy. I hear a lot right now about concern about the breakdown of rule of law. And if you think about it, that rule of law doesn't really ring true with working people. They see the exploitation that led to the Great Recession and the people who did not go to jail. And then they see that the system is very unfair for them. But in their union halls, it's the one place where they get the opportunity to come together. And it is the last non-self-selecting place in America. The boss chooses who is in the work group, who is in the union, not the union members themselves. They have to figure out how to get along. And so in order to get along and in order to have a set of demands that they are collectively bargaining over, they have to hear each other out, hear each other's issues. And that can be a whole range of ages and genders and backgrounds and religions or none and identifications. And there may be different issues in the workplace because of those things, but they've got to hear each other out and come to, at first, an agreement about what those common demands are going to be. Because in order to back up those demands at the bargaining table, they also have to be ready to say what they're willing to do if they don't get them, which means that in our case, that's really the threat of a strike. And in order to have a real threat of a strike, you have to have over 90% of the workforce engaged in that. I mean, imagine if we had to deal with any issue in this country and we had to get 90% support in order to get it achieved. It doesn't happen. So people are forced to come together and have a democratic process just to decide those demands first, and then have a process where they're fighting for that together. And then they are voting on that agreement at the end of the day and living with it and understanding that even if they vote against it, if the majority votes for it, that's the way you're going to move forward. So the best chance that people have to participate in democracy that they can really experience and understand the value of that democracy is in a union hall. This is why it's so important that we are making it more possible for workers to join unions. And I would just say that in this moment, Elon Musk thinks that he is going to get away with squashing unions altogether by getting rid of the NLRB. Well, it was 1934, before we had the Wagner Act, that we had general strikes all over this country and incredible instability. And what that did was it brought actually the bosses to the table too to say, we want labor law. That labor law is written more for the stability of the businesses than it was even for the workers. But it created the kind of power that was necessary in order for FDR to put through the New Deal. And all of the things in the social contract that we think of in this country, if you are participating in the economy with that work, that you're going to have the ability to have a secure life and a secure retirement. So this is, we've got to support unions, but what I would say even more so is that this is a moment where we can't just think about this. I think a lot of times people think of unions as sort of special interest groups, especially since we've shrunk to such a low number. And people also think of it as the union presidents that they interface with here in Washington. But really what it is look at that polling. Look at the polling of 70% of Americans who support unions. They support unions because they see that unions have gotten results when voting, in their view, has not. And those results have come relatively quickly. Now, I'll tell you, the unions would tell you a different story about all the work that went behind those results. But they're seeing that brings results. So we need to be speaking to the 70% of people who want a union and can actually practice that in their workplace. And some of them are already practicing this today without even having a contract. Starbucks workers, for example, getting changes in their workplaces by acting like a union and getting those results. And originally, before labor law was in place, there was recognition and a contract that came when workers would rise up and come together. So in this moment of urgency, that is something that we can encourage from the working class, is that the power actually resides there. And if people come together and act like a union today, and we spread that idea of solidarity, we can actually turn the idea of power on its head. Because Elon Musk has money and control, but he does not have any power. His rocket does not take off without the engineers or the people who are going to put it in place, or the flight attendants who are calling us for representation, serving lunch. And so it is really, really important that we are lifting up the idea of unions and people working together and cutting through those divisive tactics that would keep us from experiencing that democracy.
That's great. And so I really appreciate you putting the focus on the how economic policy is made through worker power, worker organization, just as much as what that policy agenda looks like. Curious your thoughts on this, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. One is I really want to echo what Sarah said about the importance of unions. If you look across the world, unions have been a critical part of the civil society defense of democracy. And more broadly, I think we should be thinking very seriously about how policies are encouraging greater democratic strength of democratic citizenship and civic organization. I think the essay that you and Shana wrote to introduce this set of essays was really astute on this question. And so, building on the work that you've done, that Paul has done, I think we need much more serious thinking about how public policies themselves can help improve the quality of democratic citizenship, can create the kinds of dignitary effects that we've been talking about. And I completely agree with Sarah, to do it in a way that is simple, traceable, transparent, understandable. And we have to recognize that there's some real failures of public policy and government capacity that lie behind why policy has not done that. So yeah, I think this is a very important agenda, and I can talk a little bit more about the policy priorities in a moment.
That's great. So staying on the theme of the labor movement, Sarah, as a labor leader and organizer, could you share a bit of your thinking of how unions can help defang and diffuse the appeal of right-wing populism amongst their members?
Yes. So this part of the problem that we have is the control over the messaging throughout our society. There's incredible control over the kind of narrative that's being set. And I think about also like the villains in the election. We were vilifying Black men who voted 80% for Harris, but we were vilifying them for like moving away from it. It's turned on its head. It's total BS. So we need to be able to recognize that unions are a place where people are more likely going to trust the information that they're getting because they're getting it from people that they know. This is a place where we can have those conversations. And my experience as a union leader is that when people have good information, they make good decisions. It's when we are giving them bad information that they don't. On this reconciliation package is terrible, terrible, okay? This is not about the deficit. Nobody gives actually it is actually money that is in the private sector. Where did Elon Musk get his money? From our government. That's our money. So the rich have too much money. They have taken too much, but we can actually talk about the policies. We should be attacking this Republican budget that is going to do away with Medicare. I have members in our union who are going to be devastated by this. Members whose parents need extra attention because of Medicaid, or the people who are going to have to drive 2 and 3 and 5 hours to get to a hospital because hospitals are going to close if we don't have this. Why are we not talking about the actual issues that relate to people as opposed to this fictitious deficit that is hanging over our head, which is actual baloney? Because we all know that that deficit is actually a surplus for the private sector. And so why are we not making sure that that surplus is going to the ground up class so that they don't have to work 2 and 3 jobs to survive, so that they have time to participate in the democracy? This is a huge part of democracy. They don't have time to do it, and they don't believe in it because it hasn't been working for them, and no one has been speaking to their issues. The last thing I'll just say is that when Andy Beshear won in 2018, Reverend Barber had gone to Macomb County and had asked a guy with the last name McCoy, he was the real McCoy, why that county voted 80% for Trump in the last election. And he said, we know Trump is shit, but he came here. And then he came back. And then he sent his staff here. And we haven't seen a Democrat since LBJ. So we're going to talk to the person who's at least talking to us and talking to our issues.
That's powerful. Jacob, did you want to get in on this point, or?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to talk a little bit about the arguments that Paul and I make in the piece about how we should be thinking about the place of policy in this larger critique. And I should say, I think it's really important that we recognize that there has been both this huge shift over time in economic well-being, something that John Cohen will talk about. We have this new measure, the core score, that looks at county level well-being, and it's a much better measure than the ones that Sherrod Brown was critiquing. And there's just we really cannot shy away from the fact that policy has failed in multiple areas to deal with the real strains that Americans are facing. I do think we should recognize that, this particular economic juncture, that politically economic juncture that Democrats faced in the 2024 election was a very difficult context. Okay, the liberals, which is a conservative party in Japan, and conservatives in the UK are all losing office. Not a single incumbent party gained vote share. The first time that's happened since we've been not to absolve the Democrats for some of the many personal changes, long-term as well as short-term missteps, basically about kind of structural reasons why the party and progressive ideas have had such a difficult time. And so one thing that we try to emphasize is that there have been real challenges of implementation in progressive policy, and that those were on stark display during the Biden presidency. And we talked a lot about deliverism during this period, but deliverism can't work if you don't actually deliver in time for it to make a difference in elections. And Paul and I talk about how we need to pay much more attention to whether policies are understandable, are visible, are traceable, whether they reinforce, as Sherrod Brown discussed so eloquently, a sense of dignity and status tied to citizenship, as well as provide benefits, and whether they, and this is, I think, the most important neglected point, whether they activate organized supporters, not just whether or not they might cause a voter to change their view in advance of an election. And so part of this is going to be about messaging and mastery of a really, really transformed media world. And I don't know how to do that. That is above my political science pay grade. But I do think that's part of it. But part of it is recognizing how to build power through policy better. And we should recognize that in such a tight electoral context, even marginal effects can be quite substantial, especially as they accumulate. And this is something, unlike a lot of the things that affect whether a government rises or falls, that policymakers have control over. So I think the call to action here is that and affect governance and outcomes through their effects on organized groups and other political actors.
Thanks, Jacob. And Suzanne Mettler is with us today, who's also been one of the leading researchers in this area, and we're excited to hear from her in a moment. But before we turn things over to the audience for a couple quick questions, if we have time, would love to hear from you, Sarah, on any calls to action that you might have, thinking about the folks in this room, journalists, policymakers, policy thinkers.
Yes. Okay. So in order to solve a problem, you have to define it. It is really important that the people in this room are defining it and defining the real problems, not the fake ones, the real problems. And then we do need to set demands. And we need to be very clear about what it is that then we need to back that up with what we're willing to do. So the other thing that I would just say to all of you is take a moment to actually get out on a picket line and stand out there with striking workers and hear their stories, and bring your friends and neighbors with you too. Go to a Tesla takedown event and spread the word that it's time for everyone to bring clarity, because the last component to solving problems is adding urgency. One thing to say is that, I'm out there calling for a general strike for it as people are being disappeared off the street because they wrote an op-ed in opposition to what our government's doing. And so we need to really be spreading the message that working people can take control and getting back to those principles and sharing that. A lot more agreement out there. When I uttered general strike during the shutdown, I was getting letters from the airline saying, you can't do that. No one is sending me letters today. People instability in this moment that we're in. And they're saying it quietly in the boardrooms, but it's happening. And so we just have to act with a lot more urgency ourselves to get results.
That's great. I appreciate you putting this moment into the larger context of, where we fit in and social, political, economic instability.
As we're talking with people who are in the business world, the other benefit of having unions on the property is that when workers are bargaining, they get to understand the context of that bargaining. How much money is there for them to get? What is their fair share? And typically, workers then understand the business better too. And that is a benefit to the people running the company. I mean, unless they're trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes and send it all to Wall Street in stock buybacks. But it makes for a better business when you have everyone engaged and you have everyone feeling like they can take part in it because they are respected enough to have a contract for that work.
Yeah, that is a great point. Well, I'm looking to Melissa to see if we have time for 1 to 2 questions. And it's such a great group of people in this room, so I'm hoping that we can get a couple voices and questions from the collective brilliance in here. Chirag, if you could introduce yourself and keep your question brief so we can get to a couple.
Okay, hello, my name is Chirag Baines. I'm at Brookings and Democracy Fund, was in the Obama and Biden administrations. Sarah, I was really struck by your comments that were both about economic populism and fighting for working people, and also about gender and racial justice. And this is a moment in which there's real retrenchment around civil rights and race, and there's an argument, including on the left, that we just shouldn't talk about these things, gender, race, sexuality, sexual orientation, because they are divisive, right? We will lose parts of our coalition. And there's even an argument about we just need to deliver more, to Jacob's point, or deliverism, that sort of thing. And we should put some of our regulatory concerns around the environment, around civil rights and equity to the side, make those lesser priorities. And there's a bit of this that's in your rising tide metaphor, Sarah. So I just wonder, sitting where you sit, all of you, but particularly Sarah, I'm interested in your thoughts here. How are you thinking about this in terms of the policy agenda, and how are you talking about these issues? To what extent are you still talking about? You talked about it here, I know, but with in the union world and with workers, and what do you prescribe for us?
That's great. Actually, could we collect 1 more or 2 more? Here.
My name is Gus. I'm a recent graduate of Cornell's Global Development Master's Program, so great time to be going into that field. Thank you all. That was a great presentation. My question is sort of calling back to what Sherrod said about people craving dignity and purpose, and on the other hand, the necessity of real economic Bill of Rights. How do you square those 2 things in policy, and how do you square those 2 things politically?
Great. And maybe 1 more, and then we'll turn it over to the panel.
Thank you so much for this. My name is Thea. I run a nonprofit called the Futures Institute. And my question would be for all of you, but probably particularly for Sarah. Thinking about the desired future of labor policy, just in the sense that we do need to have resurgence of solidarity amongst the working class. Clearly, unions are a big part of that. But as you noted, the National Labor Relations Act was not really written to actually help unions be all that they could future we want. Are there a few specific changes that you would imagine making to the NLRA, or just a different framework that might do a better job of getting the kind of strong labor sector we want.
Great, thank you so much. So future of labor policy, how to make economic dignity real, and how do we think about these competing narratives around gender and racial justice and economic justice at the same time? So easy questions for our final wrap up.
If you go into any room anywhere, people will one of the first questions they'll ask is, what do you do? People are very much tied to their jobs. The idea that we would actually run an economy where we would presume that 5% of the economy of the workforce is out of work at any time in order to keep inflation down. Just like in my shoes about people's own identities. And it's tied to dignity of work is tied directly to what are the safety policies in that workplace? Do workers have a voice in that workplace? Are workers making enough money in that workplace? Because one of the reasons there is that dignity in work, I think about the United Mine Workers of America. I think about those miners who, I mean, mining is a terrible job. It's horrible. It'll break down your body. You're subject to black lung. There's all kinds of horrible things, but miners take incredible pride in the work that they do. That's because through their union, they built up good jobs where they could actually take care of their families and feel pride in that. And that's what people, really want. In terms of, how do we address this issue that because there's been an attack on social issues and on identity issues, that we shouldn't be talking about that, is I think that what that means is that white men are still defining the narrative that we should have. So let's recognize that first. Okay. But secondly, if I'm a union leader and I want to go out and we're all in jeopardy of being mistreated. And it wasn't until our union, I think I have the benefit of being mentored by women. I have the benefit of being in a union that has always been sort of dismissed and disregarded. And so we had to be very creative about the way that we were getting results. But I heard, recently that we were the white girls union. And we set about an effort to really work on diversity and inclusion in our union and to make union pins that would identify people's heritage. And all of a sudden, the people who started the rainbow of people in our union. And so it is really important, if we're going to actually change things, we have to do that together. Dr. King, a lot of people like to talk about the 1963 Dr. King, as Eddie Glaude would say, but we should talk about the 1968 Dr. King, who was talking about dignity of work, and he was talking about safety, and he was talking about social justice being directly tied to economic justice, and he was also talking about peace and taking on war, and he was very I've seen the Promised Land, and I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get there. And if we are not rejecting these calls for us to stop talking about people are having. We be ill about that. Like, we have not done enough to actually create the coalition that can win, because we have not given voice and leadership and space to all of the people who have been marginalized, felt bias in their lives, felt disregarded, and had to be very creative. These are the people who are going to come with the solutions. And these are the people who are going to empower our economy and our politics in a way that is going to allow us to take on the challenges of tomorrow.
That was so well said. And I wonder if, Jacob, you wouldn't mind, because I think we're hitting up against time, if you want to take a
statement.
Yes, a lightning round.
Amen.
So please join me in a hearty round of applause for our fantastic panel. And I think we've discovered the secret to following a Sarah Nelson speech, which is to have her on your panel.
Thank you for the great discussion, Alex, Sarah, and Jacob. I'd like to now invite our first panel up to the stage. So Jia-Lin Yang will moderate this panel. Ms. Yang is the national editor at the New York Times. And joining her, we have Jonathan Cohen, Senior Program Officer at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where he leads the organization's work on the economy. Suzanne Mettler, the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions and Department at Cornell University, and Paul Pierce.
And I'm excited to talk to this panel because I feel like one core question that we are also wrestling with probably since November 2016 is the why. Why is this happening? Before you get to the what. So I'm eager to dive in. Why don't we just start with that question? So what, you all have thought deeply. What are, in your view, the main causes of what we're seeing right now?
Okay, nice, easy one to start. I would say well, let me say first of all that I'm here in my capacity at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, but I wrote the essay for this series with Kathy Kramer at the University of Wisconsin. So I apologize that I don't have like a charming Midwestern accent, but I am going to sort of, in all this, sort of channel her and what I hope she would say as well, which is, again, if I'm going to distill it down to, let's say, one word to start, and it's a word I think Jacob or someone else used earlier, let's say the word status, in terms of people's feeling of precarity, whether it's both actual economically or politically, but also of chasing this American dream and this corporate ladder that they used to be able to climb reliably of sports gambling has sort of like become like the bet on like right-wing populism.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to give a quick answer to. So hopefully what we all say will kind of fit together. I mean, I think I would start with the fact that this is happening all across the affluent world. Right? It's not, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this. It's not a distinctly American phenomenon, and so I think that helps us to place a little better what is going on. And I would begin. Jacob was saying a little bit about this. We are going through a profound economic transformation. The transformation some people would call knowledge economy or post-industrial economy, shift towards much more service-oriented employment. And that is, I think in many ways, that is as profound a change as a change from an agrarian to an industrial economy. It's hugely disruptive for half a century. So I reinforce ways and many
random in presidential elections. And then in the later 90s, this gap began that was particularly driven by rural Americans moving more and more to the Republican Party with each election. And we looked at congressional voting. It happened there as well. It's very and we've collected place-based data, county-level data, all cases in the U.S. based on contemporary data. What we find is that as the period from 1992 to 2004, it was driven by talking of agricultural consolidation, the demise of family farms. You have loss of lots of jobs and extractive. Surprised to realize what a large component of rural counties' employment that had been and how much had been lost. And so what we find in our quantitative analysis, controlling for all of these other things, is that in counties that saw jobs stagnating or worse yet declining, those were the counties that have moved the most toward voting for Republican candidates, and particularly in that period, the late 90s, early 2000s, and they are rural counties. And then we saw the same thing for counties that were losing population, that they experienced the same trend. There were subsequent things that happened that deepened the divide. I won't talk about that right now, but I just want to emphasize the point that, you know, in the United States, as Jacob mentioned, that have less population, and that's always been the case. But in the past, both parties have benefited from that, so they've kind of washed each other out. Now they're consolidated in many different aspects of government.
These are great answers for a question that's been chewed over a lot. So you guys did great. So Paul, maybe dig a little bit deeper into a point that you were mentioning just now, that this is a global phenomenon, but curious, what are the differences then? And what does that mean for going forward?
Yeah, it is global. And I think that has, and I agree, like the rural-urban divide, you see that in lots of countries that are having this kind of experience. You also see huge divides around education, around gender, around race. All those things show up cross-nationally. How is the U.S. distinctive, and what difference does that make? And here, so we were talking before about you didn't want to follow Sarah. Following Jacob is a problem because he made the 2 points that I was planning on making. It reminds me of the joke about faculty meetings where somebody near the end says, everything has been said, but not everybody has said it, and then proceeds to say it. But I think actually I can take the 2 points and just push them a little bit further. And I think the starting point to think about the U.S. comparatively is right-wing populism is not uniquely popular in the United States compared with other countries. But I think it is uniquely powerful compared with other rich democracies. Right? Not uniquely popular. I would say you have about 30% support in like country after country for sort of what we would think of as the core of a right-wing populist agenda. But the U.S. is different in two critical respects, and one of them is about institutions. And Suzanne's point is exactly right about the kind of rural bias of American institutions, especially the Senate. But of course, it carries over really powerfully to the Supreme Court. It's amazing that, you know, Republicans have lost a popular vote over and over again in presidential elections, and yet they have 6 seats on the Supreme Court. Right? And that is largely because of the bias of the Electoral College and the bias of the U.S. Senate. Right? So rural bias is important. The other thing about institutions that I think is super important that Americans take for granted, we have a two-party system, basically because of our constitutional arrangements. Right? And a two-party system, which most countries do not have this arrangement. With the two-party system, the right-wing populists just have to capture one political party, right? And then if it happened in the U.S. because of polarization, Eric Schickler and I have a recent book on this, Partisan Nation, which talks through how our political system has become nationalized. It's nationalized polarization, and that means that the parties act much more as unified blocs. So this makes right-wing populism able to leverage that 30% into political power and then operate in very dangerous ways, right? Because of the way our parties have now become teams, like the complete capitulation of Congress, for example. And we'll see about the Supreme Court, but I'm not hugely optimistic about the Supreme Court, which the majority of which is also part of the Republican team. Right? So one is this point about institutions, and the other is about what Jacob and I call plutocratic populism, right? Which is absolutely distinctive about American politics. And I don't want to go on too long, so I won't say much more about this, except to say, so Jacob and I wrote a book called Winner Take All Politics back in 2010, right? At which point we were talking about how much the rise of top-end income and wealth inequality was eroding the quality of American democracy, right? And empowering, we weren't calling them plutocrats then, but empowering plutocrats. Well, in 2010, the top 25,000 donors in the U.S., that's 1/100th of 1% of people giving money to campaigns, 25,000 people, they gave about 30%, right, of the money that went to federal elections, right? 30% coming from the top 1/100th of 1% of donors, 25,000 people. Right? Now the top 400 donors give almost 30% of the money for federal elections. Right? Thank you, Citizens United, and a bunch of other decisions like that. Thank you, growing increases of wealth and income inequality in the U.S. So American economy has become much more unequal, and the translation of that economic inequality into political inequality has moved much, much further in the period since 2010. It's really astonishing, and other countries don't see anything like this. There's a lot more to be said about that. I'll just say one thing, which is, I do think as we lead into the next panel, we're thinking about what do we do. In some ways, plutocratic populism creates really important opportunities because plutocrats are not popular. Right? Plutocrats are not popular. Right? A lot of what these governments, and this was true of Trump 1, it was actually true of Bush 2, and it's definitely super wealthy that are not popular and are going to create important political opportunities.
Can I ask, I'm just curious, the plutocrats in other countries, where do they fit in for their politics?
Well, so first of all, there aren't as many. They don't have nearly as much wealth. I mean, you know, astonishing, and we've all seen it, right? So Trump is giving his inaugural address, right? And the 3 wealthiest men in the world, 5 of the 7 wealthiest men in the world, one of them actually a French national, right? We're on the stage behind him, right? That's happening in American elections. I mean, just a level of wealth, the concentration of wealth is much greater in the United States than it is.
John, I was really fascinated by your essay with Kathy because you're looking at economic measures and you're kind of speaking directly to one of the other ongoing mysteries of the 2024 campaign where Democrats kept asking, the economy's so great, why is everyone so unhappy? And you asked some, I think, pretty provocative questions about what we're even measuring. And I thought of your essay this morning when there was another like 3 alerts on my phone about inflation, not so bad. And then I thought, well, does that really tell us much about how the country's actually doing? So say a little bit more about what we're missing, and when you look at the other measures that you would actually point to, what do we find out?
Yeah, I mean, Senator Brown sort of alluded to this too about sort of when we talk about like how is the economy doing, we're really talking about like how is inflation doing, how's the stock market doing, and how the Dow Jones and maybe unemployment rate if you're lucky. And like we've sort of reduced the economy to like 4 things, which first of all, some people take issue with like how those are actually calculated. And if you like dig into the surface of how inflation gets calculated, it's like it's a little iffier than you would think. It's not just like the price of eggs, which obviously was sort of like the headline of the election. And so sort of build on that assumption, and I say we, representing this broader commission that worked on it at the Academy that included Jacob as well, who might as well be on this panel at this point. We built sort of what we see as sort of like an alternative measure rooted in not like economic growth for the sake of economic growth, but by our measure, our sort of North Star for economic measures should be well-being and like how Americans are actually doing. And so our composite measure, our aggregate index, is built on a grouping of sort of economic security, economic opportunity, health, and political voice on the assumption that sort of those measures taken together in some sort of weird cocktail offer a better indication specifically at the county level, or at least at the sub-national or maybe the sub-state level of like how Americans are actually doing. I don't want to sound like an ad for our tool, which is free and you can all go on it online. And I can say more about sort of the
we should all go check it out, but go on.
Okay, but I'll say this. Lots of people lots of people complain about GDP and then propose alternate measures to GDP that lo and behold track at like a 95% correlation to GDP. And I promise that ours does not track at a 95% correlation to GDP. Like over the last 10 years, our top scoring states are Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Because again, this is not about like Los Angeles County probably has a larger GDP than all those states combined, but it's not about like how much economic growth you produce in the aggregate. It is about like how well off people in those places are doing along these various scores, of which actual sort of raw economics is only one, and your political voice and how well represented you are is sort of an equally weighted measure in how well you're doing in a democratic society.
While we're picking on the traditional measures, I was struck by what you all wrote about the unemployment rate, which again, you're like, well, GDP is just making more, goes to the wealthy. Unemployment, surely.
Oh, it's just people who are unemployed, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, but say more about even why that one has some issues that are worth pondering.
Right.
Here.
So it seems like the most obvious measure. It's like unemployed rate. It's like the percentage of people who are unemployed. But it's not. It's like if you've been unemployed for a certain amount of time, you're like considered out of the labor market and you don't count in the factor. If you're underemployed, you're still counted as being either employed or unemployed, depending on sort of the various field. So even like these purest distillations, you would think that sort of how could you possibly argue with the unemployment rate? Actually, you can quibble with them. You can probably quibble with my measure too, but at least like the ones that we've like sort of taken as sort of the proxies for the economy as a whole are not as sort of pure as we might imagine.
Yeah. And then do you have an example of a particular, so let's talk about some of these places. I guess the ones you've mentioned, like Wisconsin. I mean, I think of there are towns there. I mean, as a journalist, we don't deal purely in data, but we're talking to people visiting towns. I mean, there are a lot of, look at Milwaukee, not doing so hot. So what I guess is surprising to you, or, you know, what are we missing in a place like Wisconsin, for instance?
What was during the Obama administration, but took place in Wisconsin, where you go to rural places and talk to people and sort of do that journalistic work. I would say I think it's a counter narrative to what at least I saw in the aftermath of the 2016 election, which is a lot of journalists going to like rural diners in Wisconsin or wherever and being like, oh, this is why Trump won because
NAFTA.
Yeah, or whatever is going on in this diner explains like the last 5 years of American politics. And by our measure, like sort of like what's the matter with Kansas? Like not a lot. Or like at least not a lot like relative to other places. So going back to the conversation about my point about status is like there's one thing about how well off you are, and there's a whole separate thing about how well off you are, or you felt like they were getting a raw deal from plutocrats in Madison or whatever, but they were actually getting a higher percentage of the state tax revenue in redistributive services, but it didn't feel like that. And I don't know how you like address people's feelings, but I think that's it's nice to think that we live in sort of an objective society where everything's rooted in data, but of course we live in a narrative-driven one and a subjective one where like feelings actually are more important than facts sometimes.
Yes, I think we keep learning that over and over. Suzanne, would love your sense of just some historic perspective. I think especially these days, I feel like we ebb and flow with the number of Nazi Germany analogies that I hear, so I just feel like history generally, you know, and certainly there's enough news to make you ponder, has this ever happened before, where are we?
Yes.
So would love your thoughts. You've written a historical analysis on the threats that come from this kind of populism in American history, so would just love to hear more from you about where we fit in the not terribly long history of this country, but history nonetheless.
Okay. Well, I teach every year, or almost every year at Cornell, I teach this big class on Intro to American Politics. And it was becoming more and more mind-bending. I mean, you had to like rethink every lecture every year. And then along comes 2016. And, you know, I'm throwing up my hands. And I would run into my colleagues who study democratic deterioration around the world. And they seemed to understand much better than me what was going on. They had a vocabulary, they had concepts. And so I thought I need to begin to learn more from these folks. And so we formed this American Democracy Collaborative, and we have Americanists and comparativists learning from each other. And so then Robert Lieberman and I said, you know, what do we know historically about times in the American past that democracy has been in crisis? So what we learned from the comparativists is that there are 4 main threats that can endanger democracies around the world. And one is political polarization, when politics move to becoming like us versus them. Another is when politics gets to be this conflict over who belongs, who's considered a member of society, who has full status. A third is high and rising economic inequality. And then the 4th one is executive aggrandizement, or the consolidation of power in the top leader. So what Rob and I did was we looked at periods throughout American history, and we found that in fact, American democracy has been fragile on multiple occasions, time and again. And already, like right out of the gate in the 1790s, political polarization started raging, even among, you know, people who had been just before that drafting the Constitution together and saying they weren't even going to have political parties. And so it almost, you know, the nation almost went down the tubes by the time you get to the election of 1800. Then you get in the 1850s, the first 3 threats together are all combining and interacting, you know, and it leads to the Civil War, so secession and Civil War. Then in the 1890s, 1850s was the lead up to the Civil War. Then you get to the 1890s, and here you have, on the one hand, there's the really referring to what Sherrod Brown was calling populism. There was the agrarian populist movement in the United States, which was really a movement for redistribution and to producers, both farmers and in industry. But you have, you know, a lot of elites in both parties who are threatened by that. And you also have Black men, millions of Black men who've now been voting at actually really high levels for a few decades in the South. And what happens is that, you know, the 3 threats emerge, and there's this resurgence of white supremacy in the South. And then the Republican Party in the North goes in another direction. And so, you know, and you have, but the disenfranchisement of Black men for 60 years. This is major backsliding that happened in the United States, and it lasts 60 years. And once people have lost their voting rights, they lose their civil rights as well. In the 20th century, there were 2 occasions where there was one major threat that led to democracy being in danger. And the first was actually during the New Deal. But, you know, we do see the internment of Americans of Japanese descent, and in, you know, the early 1940s during World War II, the growth of a national security apparatus that can engage in wiretapping and so on. But for the most part, Roosevelt is using these new executive powers on behalf of the American people. Not so when we get to Watergate. We have all four threats have been growing for some time now and combining. And so, we wrote this book, we published it in 2020, Four Threats, and saying that, like, these are very dangerous background conditions, broad background conditions in which democracy can be in peril. The particular story that happens in any time period is different, but it's dangerous time.
And how in those past instances that you looked at, because it sounds like you're describing kind of an ebb and a flow, who knows where we are in that, but if we look in the past, how does it come back?
How does democracy come back?
Yep.
Yeah. It's, I wish I could say there's a really nice answer.
Doesn't have to be, it could be the beginning of an answer.
But there's, it's really discouraging when you look at the past. I mean, many of the earlier periods, there was a settlement at some point, and it was on the backs of Black Americans. And, that was even true, really, in the New Deal, when the New Deal Democratic Party was, for Roosevelt to deliver to the American people, he relied upon this big Democratic Party that included a lot of folks in the North and in urban areas and new immigrants with Southern white elites who were keeping Jim Crow intact. The one period where the outcome is a good outcome is actually after Watergate, where there's real bipartisan efforts in Congress to create all sorts of reforms, which have, many of them lasted until just recently, like inspectors generals, et cetera. But that was a time of low political polarization, so that was possible. We're not now in that time period.
A number of you have brought up inequality. And so how does that translate into this move toward populism, right? So people see that, how does that turn into, people see the government, how they see their own country, how they see.
Okay, now I'm going to turn back to the rural-urban divide, and this picks up a little bit on Kathy Kramer's work. So I described to you how the rural-urban divide began to emerge because of changes in the economy that left rural places behind. But then what happens next, we find, again, look at our data analysis, but also from interviews that we did with political party county chairs, Democrats and Republicans in counties that have changed dramatically over time politically, is that there was this growing sense that Democrats are urban elites and they're engaging in overreach. They're overbearing elites. So they are rolling out these policies that we in urban places have to implement, but nobody consulted us in the process, and the way it's all coming down is very overbearing. What's interesting is that we find that rural and urban people do not disagree very much on the purposes of those policies themselves, like public opinion, support for all kinds of types of government spending, like on health and education, et cetera. There's not a significant difference between people. But the theme kept coming out that people feel that Democrats are overbearing elites. And part of that has to do with what Paul mentioned earlier, and that is this growing educational divide. And so, as in the 1990s, people who are living in urban areas who have more education started gravitating toward the Democratic Party. And then subsequently, after 2008, people in rural areas started to follow the same pattern, but it's mostly people with less education. They're gravitating toward the Republican Party. And so this theme came out again and again of people what to do.
So two things I would say about inequality and right-wing populism. And the first comes out of, the story starts, I was in Paris in 2016. I got a chance to work and write there for about a month, and I shared an office with a lovely man, scholar named Daniel Ziblatt, of democracy in the early 20th century, and I was working on some stuff with Jacob on the evolution of the Republican Party, and Daniel and I had many wonderful conversations that just got us more and more depressed. We saw, as we saw the parallel to Germany and what we were looking at. And the way I would summarize that would be to say that high inequality makes conservative parties the enemy of democracy. That's a slight oversimplification, but high inequality makes conservative parties the enemies of democracy, right? Because they want to defend inequality. A lot of their powerful backers defend inequality. And so really the only way that they can mobilize support in a competitive electoral system is by amping the rest of the electorate up, right? And finding other enemies for them to oppose, right? Jacob and I developed this argument in Let Them Meet Tweets. We produced in more on what's happening in the mass population, which we're finding partly Bill someone was saying like, right, which is, so what happens when conservative, which a lot of the voters they're trying to appeal to are so disillusioned about institutions, so disillusioned about government, right, that you create this, I think, very discouraging, certainly discouraging for a political scientist who's used to the idea that elections are going to kind of like force political elites to be at least somewhat responsive to the needs of their voters. There's a wonderful new book coming out, Wonderful Shepherd, which looks at what's happened around by Republican governments in these levels, including not accepting expansion, stuff like that. So that's a quite discouraging story, and I think it does just suggest it is profoundly important that people who don't think that's a great dynamic for any of us try to figure out how do you break that doom loop. And I think 4 years ago, a lot of political scientists thought, well, the way you do that, deliverism is the way you do that. Design good policies that are actually really targeted, like, a lot of this is going to go to red states, to rural communities, and it's not going to the blue state constituencies, actually quite the opposite in a lot of cases, right? And people were willing to do that, and partly they thought, well, that's going to generate positive feedback. That's going to get us out of the doom loop. Give up on those ideas, but I think we need to realize now it is much, much harder to break that cycle than we thought, and that we probably need strategies that are not just about what, we do need to deliver those things, right? But it's not just about concretely what you deliver. That is seen and
potentially provocative, thinking about the need to strengthen democracy. Democracy is producing this outcome as well. So what does that tell us about democracy? I mean, this is what people, this is what people want.
Well, it's a highly biased democracy, right? And I mean, I will be honest with you. So I teach a class like Suzanne's class. How do you teach Introduction to American Politics to 300 Berkeley students who are, 18 years old and really, honestly, have very little conception of how different this is? And how do you teach that in a way that's not just, oh, look, Berkeley professor with his hair on fire? It's like, that doesn't work. It's really a challenge. But one thing that I come pretty close to saying these days, and for this audience, I feel comfortable saying, it's like, we should really, even before the astonishing things that are going on right now, right? Astonishing things that are going on right now. We should really question, right? Is the U.S. a democracy, right? And they're competitive. The system is unbelievably biased, right? I mean, the overrepresentation in the Senate, again, I mean, just that simple fact, Democrats, despite winning the popular election, right, have not appointed a majority of Supreme Court justices since the early 1970s, right? And extremely powerful Supreme Court, right, in comparative perspective. How democratic is that? How democratic is a system where 30% of the money, the huge amounts of money in federal elections, are coming from 400 people? Right? How democratic is that? How democratic is a Senate where one party has had the majority in the Senate about half the time since 1996, even though it has never in that period represented a majority of voters? Never. Which hypothetically allows something like 17 or 18% of the US population to block legislation. Right? So I think I mean, obviously elections still matter a lot, and we need to understand why voters are voting for what they're voting for. But I think we really should ask questions about to what extent it's fair to call that system a democracy.
I'm just reminded of a Mencken quote that I'm going to butcher, which is, democracy is when people want something and they get it good and hard. And I think that's maybe part of the doom loop that Paul is describing. I'll just say on inequality front, I think in addition to the sort of sexy data tool that you're all going to go check out immediately after this panel, we did sort of some qualitative conversations sort of around the country, and we don't see the sort of splitting of hairs that Paul and Suzanne have sort of so capably provided, of like people seeing like corporations over here and like political institutions over there. They see it as like a system, and it's like the system writ large is not working, and it's not like, oh, these politicians are working for me and these aren't. It's just like, no, politicians are working for me. Like how it's experienced and how it's treated. And then I would also say you asked about inequality, but I'm going to sort of answer a slightly different question, or at least I know this is debated, the degree to which inequality contributes to insecurity, but I think again it's sort of the problem and this lack of trust that people have in the system or in politics sort of specifically, that sort of leads down this rabbit hole towards populism, is related to this economic insecurity, again, which has its own feedback loop of you lack sort of economic resources or political standing. You become distrustful of the institutions that are best suited to improve your political representation and your economic standing. Those institutions get worse because people have lack of faith in them and so on. So this is maybe a different doom loop to the one you're describing, but they all lead to doom. So what's sort of the difference? But again, so insecurity relative to inequality.
All right. Well, thank you. I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you all so much for your insights, and thank you all for listening. Thank you for the great discussion, Jalen, Paul, Suzanne, and Jonathan. I'd now like to invite our second panel to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Jerusalem Demsis as our moderator. Jerusalem is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and host of the Good on Paper podcast. And joining her, we have Tim Bartik, a senior economist at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, Adam Dean, an associate professor of political science at George Washington University, Chirag Mehta, policy center, associate professor of government at Cornell University, and inaugural director of the Cornell Center for Racial Justice and Equitable Futures.
Okay, hello everyone. We don't have a clock up here, so I'm going to be periodically checking. Oh, I don't have a watch either, so we're just going to go on about. Fantastic. Okay. So, moderator's prerogative, something each one of the three academics over here have, well, three of our academics, not sitting together, have proposed ideas for how to respond to right-wing populism. And Chirag has worked directly in organizing spaces which are places where we can learn a lot qualitatively about this work as well. So what I want to do is kind of go one by one through the three proposed solutions and have kind of everyone on the panel talk about them, so we can get a little interdisciplinary rather than siloed. Tim, I'm going to start with you. So your focus is on place-based policies and how those sorts of investments can push back on the types of distressed communities, the problems these distressed communities have faced, many of whom are identified in the previous panel as sources for rising right-wing populism. Can you describe how place-based investments push against right-wing populism?
Okay, technology is working now. I guess the main point I want to make, pushing back against the pessimism, is that place-based policies can work to take a local economy facing significant competitive challenges and turning it around. I don't think, however, there's one solution. I mean, one of the key things I want to say is one size does not fit all. What works for one local economy will not work for another. The only common elements, it seems to me, are one, local leadership that is willing to come up with a strategy to reinvent the local economy. If you're facing competitive challenges, just doing the same old thing is a recipe for death. You got to adapt to a changing economy. And so you need the local leadership that can recognize that, come up with a sensible strategy, and then you need to somehow mobilize the resources to implement that strategy in the absence of really any significant state and federal support for this, state and federal government support. So in my work, I've given lots of examples. You know, in the interest of time, I'll just briefly mention 4 today. Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Crosby-Ironton area of Minnesota, which is on the edge of the Iron Range. So what have these areas done? Lehigh Valley faced the collapse of the steel industry in the early 1980s. What did they do? They particularly tried to encourage high-tech spin-offs from Lehigh University, and they also did some stuff with warehousing. They did some selective stuff with manufacturing, but on the whole, they emphasized high-tech and warehousing a lot more. They had a research university, Lehigh University. Grand Rapids, Michigan, not the strategy. Grand Rapids, Michigan does not have a research university. What it has is a lot of small and medium-sized manufacturers. Some of which are in office furniture, some of which are in auto supply. They helped a lot of them diversify into healthcare. They helped upgrade the job training in a lot of these areas. They didn't have a research university, they bought one. A bunch of rich poobahs at Grand Rapids, I shouldn't say bribe, they induced Michigan State University to relocate much of its medical school to Grand Rapids. Okay, so that's what they did in Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids has had manufacturing job growth over the last 30 years. It has twice the US average in manufacturing employment as a share of the economy. Tulsa, Oklahoma, oil and gas area. Obviously, they recognize oil and gas is not the future. They've emphasized remote worker attraction. They've emphasized trying to build up high tech, particularly in software. They, again, do not have a research university. They've gotten the local private college to emphasize software development. They also do some stuff in drone manufacturing, building on some strengths in aviation. Crosby-Ironton, Minnesota. They have a bunch of abandoned open pit iron mines. What did they do? Well, they became picturesque lakes. They built in a premier mountain biking course around the lakes. This builds up tourism. It attracts remote workers. It attracts people with second homes. Does this mean that every rural area in the US should develop mountain biking? No, it does not mean that. It means you need to have a strategy based on your location, based on your particular strengths, and see what works. And one of the key things here is you need the resources to do it. If someone's forgotten that things like TVA, which the federal government did in the past, at its peak spent $300 per capita for around 10 years. $300 per capita for about 10 years. That's about what it takes to turn around a local economy.
Tim, I want to interrupt you because I'm a journalist and that's what we do. And I want to push you here because I think that we want to distinguish between two things on this panel. One is certain policy outcomes that we think are great. We might care about manufacturing growth increasing. We might care about, other forms of, tourists increasing or increasing remote workers living somewhere. But focusing on right-wing populism, 3 of the 4 places you mentioned, I don't know Crosby, Minnesota, but Lehigh, Pennsylvania, Grand Rapids, Michigan, these are not places that show like a real repudiation of right-wing populism. So are there examples of place-based investments actually leading to the change we're looking for now?
I'm not a political scientist. I'm going to focus on solving the economic problems of these areas, not necessarily solving some political problem. That's what my interest is, solving these economic problems. Does that contribute to solving right-wing populism? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I mean, it's a matter of economic justice for me regardless of what it does. I mean, there are some peculiar politics here. A lot of the stuff in both Tulsa and in Grand Rapids are financed by, we talked about plutocrats earlier, they're financed by very rich people. I mean, in the case of Grand Rapids, the DeVosses and the Van Andels, very conservative Republicans, they're running an industrial policy in Grand Rapids. So that's interesting. And, in Tulsa, it's George Kaiser Family Foundation, a very rich oil and gas guy who I think is pretty liberal politically, but, the politics are curious. I mean, my view is we need to try to solve the economic problems of distressed places because it's the right thing to do. Whether or not that will solve right-wing populism, I have no idea.
So, Chirag, I want to bring you in here because I think that something you've talked about is equitable implementation of federal investments. And, Tim's proposal tries to target things towards areas with specific types of economic disenfranchisement. And I wonder, when you were thinking about the IRA and other federal investments that have happened in the past, a lot of industrial policy happened under the Biden administration. In your view, is there some lesson to take for that about how to equitably distribute these kind of federal resources, and how would you want to see place-based policy done in the future?
Yeah, I think a good example, and by the way, just really appreciate the invitation to participate in the conversation. Just obviously, we're at a really important inflection point in this country, and so this conversation is just one of many that has to happen. I want to talk actually about childcare and the federal investment in childcare. So we're actually coming off a day yesterday where we experienced the biggest work stoppage in the childcare sector ever in this country. 1,400 providers. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but 4 years ago when we started organizing childcare providers, about 100 closed their doors. Yesterday, 1,400 providers closed their doors, allied themselves with the families that they serve, the kids that they serve, to demonstrate and demand a fair, equitable, and just childcare system. That is amazing in and of itself. It's a huge risk for providers to take, to close their doors. But we built this power over time. We have a long way to go, but we built this power in sort of 2 different ways. One is really emphasizing this sort of culture of belonging, that really everybody, especially groups that are othered otherwise, by right-wing populists, that we all belong in this childcare system. No matter whether you're black and brown. I mean, the black and brown women are really the backbone of the childcare system. So no matter who you are, what your identity is, you belong. You teach in a public school, you teach in a preschool center, you take care of kids or teach in your home. You all belong in this system. And we also have built a sort of culture of solidarity through this work, where we believe, it's a value of ours, that there's no way we're going to win the kind of childcare system that we all deserve unless we all actually have each other's backs. No one group, whether you're preschool teachers, whether you're in the public schools, or whether you're teaching in your home, no one group can win this system on their own, that we actually do need all of us. And so, the federal government does spend some money on childcare. when we started this work 10 years ago, we really started by trying to organize both parents and providers to shape just how this program was implemented on the ground. The Child Care Development Block Grant is the program. It varies state by state how it's implemented. It's in some places the government actively tries to keep families from actually accessing the program. In other places they try harder to make it work. But the point is that families and providers absolutely cared about how this program worked. And so they wanted to engage at a very deep level on implementation. And by way of that process, they also learned why it doesn't work. And the sort of political powers that were the forces that were in play that kept the system from working. And so not only were they fighting to make sure the program as it existed worked for people, but by way of this process, they began to organize other people to participate in a political process to demand an entirely different childcare system, one that was really rooted in our values. And to me, so where we see, around the country, the movement that has propped up, this is sort of one, I guess to us, it's sort of one lens into how we beat back right-wing populism. We can actually organize around public benefits in ways that build a culture of solidarity and belonging. We fight for I call it a contract. So policy to me is a contract. I think in the labor movement world, the contract is with the employer. To me, policy is a contract with government. And so we fight for a contract that leaves no one behind. It's a contract that makes sure that everyone actually does belong, in the contract. So we fight for that contract to make sure everybody belongs. And that's how we actually can, that's one way of how we beat back right-wing populism. I think healthcare, Dr. Michener can probably say a lot more on the opportunity in healthcare, but there's tens of millions of people who are completely fed up with our healthcare system. And they understand that, healthcare owners, capitalists in the healthcare system see their illness as a source of profit extraction. And I think there's an opportunity to build real multiracial solidarity around a vision for an entirely different healthcare system, and perhaps Medicaid beneficiaries might be a tip of the spear in organizing that kind of healthcare movement. So I'm hoping we
Jamila
can
has
get into
gotten
that too.
3 bat signals in what you just said, not just her name, not just the word Medicaid, but even the idea of distributing benefits through the states. So I was it's like we planned this moment for me, so thank you, Chirag. But I was thinking about this in regards to Tim's proposal on place-based policy, because Jamila's written one of my favorite public policy books of all time, which I'm sure she's annoyed about talking about now. Everyone always asks you to come talk about fragmented democracy. But in your book, you talk about how Medicaid delivery at the state level, the local level, really differentiates itself from place to place based on like whether people want to actually give Medicaid services well, or they want to treat people with dignity. And this is like a problem with all federal programs, if they're given all federal programs that are given through block grants to states or ones that are given to localities. I mean, we saw this with the rent relief that came during the Biden administration. The distribution of that was wildly different across different localities. The attempt to get it from tenants was wildly different, and people experienced it very, very differently depending on where they lived. I wonder if, when we're thinking about place-based policies, then ones that would be implemented at the local level, where that research kind of comes in to inform how that should be done, or should we just be skeptical about whether that kind of policy is a good way of distributing resources and benefits?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So many bat signals, and I love them all, and I appreciate the skepticism. And I think there's maybe some gaps to bridge between the conversation that's been bubbling up here and the conversation that the panels prior to us have had, right? So a couple of times, this idea of deliverism, or this idea of policy that sort of really engages, connects, and addresses the challenges that people are facing in their everyday life, right? Whether it's around accessing healthcare and being able to live healthy lives, or whether it's around economic justice and being able to have access to necessary economic resources, we think about policy as the vehicle for providing that, right? But it turns out it's much more complicated than that. And even in an ideal world where there's an administration that is passing policies that are attempting to do that, right? You mentioned rent relief under the Biden administration. We might think about Medicaid via Medicaid expansion or what have you. There can still be disconnects, right? Because of the way the policies are implemented and of the differential ways they're implemented in different places, right? Particularly in a federated polity like the one we have now, And even given sort of local heterogeneity and differences in how things are happening at the local level. So that's challenging. It creates a disconnect between what is being delivered and what is being experienced, right? And that's under the best circumstances, when there are actually things being delivered, right? We're in a different phase now, but even under the best circumstance, that disconnect is a problem. And at the same time, all morning or all afternoon, I don't even know what time of day it is, as we've been talking about right-wing populism, part of what we've been reflecting on is that at the heart of it is a disconnect, right? A feeling that the government is not actually doing what I need. It's not giving me what I need, whether it's folks in rural areas, whether it's low-income people who are suffering, whether it's anyone facing economic insecurity, I'm not getting what I need from the government. Why should I care about it? Why should I invest in it? And that kind of thinking is driving the core political problem here, right? And this is where I want to sort of intervene around what Tim said, where Tim said, well, I'm thinking about economic justice, not the political pieces. And I think the logic of what us political scientists call policy feedback is that those things are deeply connected, right? That the choices that we're making around economic, and in fact, I would say part of the logic of this whole essay series, but the choices that we're making around economic policies, or even around policies we might not think of as economic, healthcare policy you may or may not think of as economic policy, housing policy you may or may not think of it that way, but it is affecting people's economic and material well-being in really profound ways. And the choices that we make about that are not just around economic realities, but they feed into political realities. And they're feeding into those political realities in ways that are perverse, right? And in ways that are creating the doom loops that Paul talked about and that John talked about, and that are deepening those doom loops, right? And I appreciate the intervention from Tim around, well, maybe there's something local, there's something concrete, there's something about what's happening in particular places, in particular people's lives, that is a way to address that. And I actually agree with that inclination. But I also think the local can be a double-edged sword, right? It can be a vehicle for deepening the disconnects between people and policy, right? And I think the suggestion is, how do we use place-based policies to bridge those disconnects, to provide another pathway, right? But the reality, and I think where your skepticism is coming from, is that place-based policies can do both, right? Or federal policies that ended up getting implemented on a place-based level in differential ways. So there are ways those policies can deepen the disconnects and further drive right-wing populism. And there are ways that those policies can bridge the disconnects and be an antidote or diffuse right-wing populism and other perverse political patterns that are at the heart of the kind of democratic rot that we've all been grappling with today. So I want to wrap up, but I'll say this, Chirag is sitting next to me and I'm super excited. We've been working on some things together, but what I will say is what I believe is a key difference between whether place-based policies or any policies, in fact, deepen our political woes or address them has to do with the process by which those policies actually get advanced. And so when people are engaged in that process in a deep and substantial way, then the policies not only will be more attentive to the realities of their lives and therefore have a chance to produce political good as well, but also the processes by which those policies get advanced are reinforcing political goods as well. And again, the economic and the political are deeply intertwined. We don't get to policies that truly meet people's economic needs through non-democratic means, right? Like, look, if there are wealthy people somewhere in Michigan that have a whole bunch of money and want to do something, okay, but that is not on a large scale going to resolve the problem, because the process to getting to these place-based policies that are going to be most effective needs to involve people, lots of people, ordinary people who are organized, right? Not just showing up now and then, voting, but not just voting. People who are organized and exercising and deploying power in ways that alter the possibilities of what those economic policies look like. And without that, I think we get the skeptical outcome that you're concerned about out of place-based policies, even if occasionally we get some that are good or that are promising or that do good things. Ultimately, that doesn't give us an antidote to the democratic problems that we're experiencing unless it's done in a way that is itself democratic.
Can I add something to this? I guess I would say that the way I would look at it is the problem with relying on benevolent local billionaires is, one, a lot of places don't have benevolent local billionaires. Two, benevolent local billionaires can sometimes favor really stupid local policies that make no sense. But the reality is there is not significant federal or state government support in most states for long-term investment in place-based revitalization. There simply isn't. We've retreated from this. We don't have things like TVA. We don't have things like the Appalachian Regional Commission. We don't have things, well, of course, urban renewal had a lot of failures, a lot of problems, how it was designed. But we retreated away from this. And we look at the state level, what on earth is California doing for the Central Valley, Fresno, Bakersfield? Squat. You know, so in general, we have a problem, and the reliance on benevolent billionaires is due to the absence of state and federal action to deal with the problem of place distress.
Can I just quickly say, totally agree, totally agree. But what I want to say is that that absence is not something to be taken as a given or as an inevitability. Instead, that absence can be rectified through power deployed from grassroots or from within grassroots communities. And I know this is not how all of us think. We're like, no, power, that's top down. But like that doesn't have to be true. And as hackneyed as the quote might be, Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, it never will, right? Those federal resources need to be demanded. And the power that it will take, which will have to be significant to successfully demand them, has to be built from the ground up, because we don't have benevolent political elites who are deciding that they want to give to the masses either. So we don't have benevolent billionaires. We don't have benevolent political beliefs. Benevolence is not going to get us there. Power will.
Adam, I want to bring you in here, and as you can tell, the theme of my moderating is creating conflict. So, no, I'm just creating it anyway. Your proposal is around the proliferation of bad jobs in the United States and the need to create better ones, which you define in various ways, including on wages and concrete benefits, as well as other less material things. Good jobs are concentrated and agglomerated in areas of the country. They are not spread equally. There's a lot of geographic inequality in where good jobs are. Tim is very skeptical of the idea that we should push people and move people towards good jobs. Areas of the country, for instance, where you see much higher relative wages, where you see greater access to a bunch of different kinds of resources, where there are different kinds of amenities people might value. And this is something that other people have written about, including my former editor, Yoni Applebaum's new book, Stuck, which is fantastic. It talks about the history of mobility in the United States. And I wonder, it feels much easier to move people to good jobs, and I know why Tim is skeptical about this, and we'll let him answer this and tell me why I'm wrong. But do you feel, from your perspective, as someone who's concerned about getting people to those good jobs, that is creating them in distressed communities is a better path than getting people to the places where they can actually access that employment opportunity? And that doesn't mean like, moving from rural Wisconsin to New York City. It can literally just mean being able to access like the major urban job center in your area.
Yeah. So is this working there or not? Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invitation. I want to give a shout out to Jimmy McCallum, who wrote the essay with me. But I think to understand the importance of good jobs, to understand the current predicament we're in terms of the crisis of democracy, crisis of income inequality, you really need to take a historical and comparative perspective on the problem. And for me, that goes back to the original struggle for democracy in each country. And I think that the nature of that original struggle, the original sins of some of those struggles, are what we're living through today. So specifically what I have in mind is looking at the role that labor unions have played in that original struggle for democracy and seeing the sort of path-dependent outcome ever since. So if you go back the last 50 years and think about where unions were an important part of the struggle for democracy versus where they weren't, we see radically different outcomes. Where unions helped lead the struggle for democracy, right after the transition to democracy, they were legitimized and rewarded with new labor legislation, new constitutions that protected workers' rights, and that set a strong foundation for strong unions, which then create the kind of good jobs that we're talking about. Following the implementation of those labor rights, you see a decrease in income inequality over time, you see an increase in the quality of democracy, and you see a decrease in the probability of reverting to autocracy. That's all what happens where unions have helped lead the struggle for democracy. They put us on a path to some kind of sustainable social democracy. In the majority of democratic transitions of the last 50 years, that wasn't the case. Unions, for various reasons, were not at the vanguard of leading the struggle for democracy. Following those democratic transitions, including the American Revolution, the development of democracy in the United States, you don't get an increase in labor rights, and you're set on a long-term trajectory of bad jobs. There can be ups and downs over time, but I think what we're currently living through is the structural problems that were created at the original moment of the creation of democracy around the world, and the sort of different process that we're speaking about there. The bad news in the United States is that our original struggle for democracy was not led by labor unions. The potentially good news and optimism, or optimistic look on this, is that today we are facing another struggle for democracy in the United States. And we've seen labor unions recognize that problem, recognize and stepping up to organize protests and small mobilizations at this point in favor of what we could only call democracy. And I think that if unions do that, I don't know about these smaller policy implementation questions that other people are talking about. In terms of the big macro perspective here, if unions in the United States step up, help to lead the struggle for democracy in the United States today, I think they will be rewarded in a sort of once-in-a-century opportunity with something like a new Wagner Act, which would put us on a better trajectory moving forward of labor rights, better jobs, higher quality democracy, and avoiding the sort of reversion to autocracy we're struggling with today. So for me, I think it's this broader historical perspective about where good jobs have come from, and it's really sort of taking advantage of those rare moments that we find ourselves in today.
Adam, you're being too nice, so I'm going to ask you again. Agglomeration, though. Good jobs are agglomerated in big cities and smaller cities, and you know, they're not equally distributed. And with even the idea of unions, it's much easier to organize in places where there's a greater density of workers. We see this repeatedly. It's much harder to organize in rural America. So you see greater returns to scale, even in places where you can see an agglomeration of workers. So don't you feel like there may be a trade-off between your vision of trying to create a unionized, dense workforce and putting extra money into place-based policies?
A lot of the work that Jamie and I have done is about the benefits of unions, not only for workers in the workplace that they're representing in terms of lower injury rates, safety, and but also the broader benefits for the community. So we did a lot of work during the pandemic about nursing homes and COVID, and we showed that unionized nursing homes had lower rates of infections not only for workers, but death rates for residents. Really trying to highlight these broader benefits. But again, I do think, picking up on what Sarah Nelson was saying earlier, I think that if you think about what the problem is for the American labor movement today, it's that there's broad support for unions, and the majority of workers, when surveyed, say they'd like to join a union, and yet we see union density down below 10%. And the reason for that is labor law and the lack of protection for labor rights in the United States. And again, I come back to this macro perspective. If we really want to see a resurgent labor movement, we need a change in labor law. And the reality, unfortunately, over the last 50 years is that a big increase in labor law, like the original Wagner Act, is much more likely during these transformations, during these fluid moments following the struggle for democracy. We didn't get that last time. Other countries have the benefit of that sort of foundation of labor rights following a sort of union-backed struggle for democracy. And I think my biggest hope for the American labor movement, but also for our society more broadly, is that we see unions step up and get rewarded for leading the struggle now for democracy in the United States.
Okay, I'm going to let Tim close himself out, and then we'll move Jamil into the hot seat.
Well, I guess I want to add something about this good jobs thing. I think there are a number of avenues to good jobs. Unions are one. Higher minimum wage is another. I see Michael Reich. I talked to him. Higher minimum wage, he can tell you all about that. You know, higher social wage through Medicare, Medicaid, health insurance, et cetera. Stronger Social Security, that's all good. But also, pushing up the employment rate, the prime age employment rate, allows for occupational upgrading, puts upward pressure on local real wages. That contributes to good jobs as well. Now, why not just move people to where the good jobs are, what was said earlier? Because it doesn't help those left behind. In fact, it probably hurts them. When we, you know, if out-migration could solve the problems of distressed places, Flint should be booming, because it's had out-migration for years. But what happens? When people move out of a distressed place, the percentage decline in population is matched by a percentage decline in jobs. The employment rate is no better. Actually, it's probably in some cases worse off. Moving people out destroys jobs. So the notion that we can, I'm all in favor of, helping, loosening up housing supply in Silicon Valley. Maybe a few people will move from Crosby, Ironton, Minnesota to Silicon Valley. Maybe a few people move from Flint to there. They'll be better off, maybe, right? So that would be good. But is that going to solve the problem of those left behind? No, it's not. You have to, at some point, address the fact that people have attachments to places. They value that. And if you don't recognize that, then I think you really can't do policies that are adapted to people's needs. We talked about dignity earlier, people's demands for dignity, the fact they value the place they're from. Most Americans are not as hypermobile as the average Harvard professor. Most Americans, like 60% of Americans live within 30 miles of where they were born. That's the reality of America. We need to deal with it.
Sure.
Well, I just want to this point, I mean, for most people, policy is something that is done to them. They have no control or power over policy and what it's doing to them. And that is actually part of, at least to us, I mean, that's part of the political problem that we have to solve for. We're not going to build a movement strong enough to beat back right-wing populism unless we really invest in the agency and dignity as put in the framing paper, like infusing policy with delivering power to people, recognizing their agency, recognizing their dignity. We are not going to build a movement strong enough to beat back right-wing populism. And so we take seriously, really on any policy, whether it's care policy, whether it's jobs policy, we always think about how do you engage people in the actual implementation of the policy we're talking about. We take people seriously at that level. They want to be taken seriously at that level. And we don't really stop at just sort of implementing the policy and making sure that the policy gets implemented well. That's an on-ramp. That's an on-ramp to organizing a much broader movement for political transformation, for real transformational change, like going back to the child care example. The child care law in this country is completely inadequate. People come to that conclusion. They come to that conclusion one way or another. But we want them to come to that conclusion alongside others who are invested in this political project of building a movement for transformational change. Because otherwise, they come to a conclusion that nothing they do matters.
I think there's actually a lot of overlap between what you just said and Jamila's proposal, which is around tenant organizing and bringing folks together through tenant organizing in order to combat the rise of right-wing populism. And Jamila, I want you to explain the mechanisms by which that happens. Like, how does tenant organizing actually lead to that pushback? And also, my skeptical rejoinder to you is we live in such a country of residential segregation. And the goal of organizing is to make salient differences that are politically helpful, not ones that are politically harmful. And doesn't tenant organizing exacerbate a lot of these problems? Like, if you're living in a building that's just your racial group and your class group and your employment group, and then you're not really getting the kind of benefits of broad-based labor organizing we see in other countries where you do bring people together in a cross-class, cross-racial coalition.
Yeah, I feel like I really enjoy your skepticism. Even when we've had conversations separate from this, it's one of my favorite things. So thank you for that. I want to say, actually, the first part of your prompt, which is what are the mechanisms through which tenant organizing might have anything to do with diffusing right-wing populism? And the second part of your prompt, which is like, but isn't this something that exacerbates potentially differences given the structural realities of racial segregation? Residentially, are actually deeply connected, right? The second part in some ways is the answer to the first part, right? So one of the things that I found while studying tenant organizing for the last 4 or 5 years is actually that the most inspiring and best organizing that happens operates in a way that actually diffuses and bridges these differences, right? So you don't go into a segregated community and organize people on the basis of that segregation in a way that's going to deepen those divides, and which would frankly further the problems that we're talking about politically, right? Instead, you think about how to organize in ways that bridge those gaps, right? And in the piece, I talk about an example from the Louisville Tenant Union that's done an amazing job of both organizing low-income Black women in public housing projects and organizing low-income white folks in trailer homes, right? But not organizing them separately, not going to one set over here and another set over here and saying like, well, we're gonna do with you what works for you, and we're gonna do with you what works for you. But instead, bringing those folks into the same space and saying, actually, what looks like very different and in some ways potentially what could be framed as competitive prerogatives, like you think that you're struggling in this trailer home because the Louisville city government is investing too much into these Black people in public housing. Actually, that's not the nature of the problem. And once you understand, we develop a shared understanding of the nature of the problem, we can see that it's the same problem, or not the same problem, but it's the problems are a manifestation of the same underlying challenges, right? In terms of who has power, who has resources, how it's being distributed, who has voice, right? And so you use organizing as a mechanism to bring these very different kinds of people together and to then channel their combined power, which we need, right? And so, and how do you do that? There's, Chirag could probably tell you the mechanisms like on a really, in a really nuts and bolts way better than I can. But part of it is by providing those folks with a shared narrative, helping them to co-develop a shared narrative, allowing them to see each other and one another's problems as connected to deeper structural problems, and then giving them ways of exercising their power together and getting material wins, even if you start with small material wins and then you build towards more. But part of the reason why I'll end with this, people are like, how are you doing this tenant organizing stuff for me? But you're the Medicaid person. I am the Medicaid person, right? And these things are deeply connected. When I was working on my first book, and as I've continued studying Medicaid since then, you talk to Medicaid beneficiaries and you ask them about what they think could be different in the program. They will tell you really specific, really smart things about how these programs can be improved, right? But there's no channel for what they understand experientially about how to improve systems like that to get anywhere. There's no channel for it to do anything. They don't have power. So we can diagnose the problems with the system, but without a way of them being able to do something, it's not clear that there's a solution to those problems. And one of the things that I got frustrated with studying Medicaid was I felt like my mission as a scholar was to diagnose problems to which there was no real solution, as far as I could tell. And when I stumbled across, in the context of different research, tenant organizing, and I started focusing on that in housing policy, I realized, organizing is actually a pathway to not just diagnosing and chronicling problems, but potentially solving them. And that's not limited to the tenant space, right? That can happen in examples Adam gave and that lots of people have given throughout the day. We've seen it happen historically and contemporarily with labor and unions. It can happen in the healthcare space, right? Organizing is a mechanism of addressing some of the problems that we've been diagnosing today. And it's a mechanism that brings in the people who are closest to the problem and makes them a central part of the solution. And so I think it's just a technique that is going to be critical to really addressing the core issues that we've been engaging today.
So Adam, I want to bring you in here because you are our resident union person. I think there's a lot of, well, I guess we have two on the stage, but we have this question about broad-based union organizing. So a lot of work from folks who do comparative research, and they look at countries where you see a lot higher union density as you see sectoral bargaining. And part of the reason why that is often better from a democratic, multi-democratic perspective is that you're actually able to get the interests of a larger swath of people, and you don't get smaller groups that often, instead of advocating for workers, capital W workers, they only care about their workers, which can happen at the expense of other people. Not always, but it can. I wonder how you think this might apply to tenant organizing, because I think it doesn't have to happen this way, but often tenant organizing, you're organizing one building, you're organizing a block, you're organizing a very small, discrete number of people. And that means you can have situations, as I've reported in tenant organizing spaces, where there are organic desires for things that are net harmful for renters in the aggregate. For instance, if you're asking for, we just want the rent in our building frozen, and that could be helpful for you, but then that means no one else in the city is actually getting any benefits from that. All the political capital is being spent on you. It might raise rents in other ways. It might raise development costs. So do you think about that theory of larger scale unionization efforts being needed applies also to this space?
I don't know anything about tenant organizing, but I will say in terms of like the broader trade-offs you're talking about, in like union debates, these are usually debates about what people call labor insiders versus labor outsiders, right? And somehow the benefits, and Sarah Nelson talked about this earlier, saying instead of saying, you know, you have a pension, I should have a pension too, we say, I don't have a pension, so you shouldn't have a pension either. I think in the healthcare union space that Jamie and I have been working on, one of the places we see this as an issue is what happens following unionization, like newly unionized nursing homes, increase labor costs. And it's a for-profit nursing home and healthcare system. And so managers then face an issue of what to do with increased labor costs following unionization. And how do we make sure that they don't do something that endangers patients, especially in the healthcare setting. And so I think what you need to do then, and maybe there's parallels with tenant organizing too, is you need unions to work hand in hand with government regulation. And so there was a federal rule which has now been overturned by the courts. Maybe many of you have seen about staffing minimums in nursing homes. So when unions newly unionize a nursing home and increase labor costs, management often responds by cutting workers or by shifting towards less skilled, lower paid workers, and that can endanger patient care. Unions, I think, increase voice in the workplace, decrease turnover and increase retention and skill and all these different ways that can offset those potential harms. But what's really needed is a federal policy or state level policy to come in and say that we're not going to allow managers to put profit above patients and to turn what otherwise is a benefit for workers into a harm for residents by basically de-skilling the workers in the nursing home. And so I think there is a need for that. I don't know if you see something similar in tenant organizing, where some of these negative spillover effects should be recognized and can be addressed through proper regulation.
And Chirag, I want to bring you in here because I think this is a space where understanding what's actually happening in organizing conversations is helpful. And you've had, I think, maybe more of that than anyone else on this stage. Often when I'm talking directly to constituents, tenants, et cetera, they are often asking for demands that are not pushing against right-wing populism, but are in favor of right-wing populism. And the way that you're describing organizing is about bottom-up power, not top-down. And it seems like some of the demands that are being made from the bottom up are ones that maybe actually encourage right-wing populism. So how should we think about that from a democratic perspective?
Can you just say one more thing on that? Like, give me.
Yeah. So I mean, for instance, there was a lot of voting for Trump, or a lot of. There was a lot of support for Donald Trump's election among senior union officials. I know that, according to Adam's paper, that there is some pushback from union voters and households themselves. But clearly, a lot of the unions that got a lot of support from the Biden administration, the demands from their workers were not uniformly in favor, or even largely in favor of pushing back against the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think a couple things on this. So, and Jamila, you should provide context to this too, if need be. But I think amongst Medicaid beneficiaries, I think Trump won Medicaid beneficiaries 49-47. It's not always been that way, but that sticks with me. Just because people are getting a public benefit, something as critical, as important as Medicaid, it doesn't mean that they aren't also, swimming in a sea of, othering kind of politics and attacks on people. They can both things can be true at the same time. The only thing that I think that I know that can combat that is organization. It is through organization that you build a different kind of culture, a culture of belonging, as I put it before, and a culture of solidarity. That takes long-term leadership development work, political education that, again, only happens through organization. And so unless we're committed to building organization, I don't think we're necessarily going to see a real change in those kinds of numbers. I mean, I think it goes back to this conversation about, what can happen when there's more place-based investment? Does that translate into different political outcomes? It can, if people are actually being organized and you really engage people at a pretty basic level about and doing a real power analysis of like why the conditions are the way they are, and how to then build really genuine solidarity with people who they would otherwise think are just very different, and some, maybe even to blame for some of the problems they experience. I don't know, there's a lot more to say on this, but it really happens, it does happen in building a very, at a human level, relationship between people in community. Yeah.
This is kind of a, oh, Tim, yeah.
Well, I guess to hop into this area of neighborhoods, I have no quarrel with tenant organizing, healthcare organizing. I think all that's great. I do think people need to think about what are the key leverage points to really affect people's lives, maybe affect their politics, but certainly affect their lives. And the whole reason I went into economics, because I think good jobs is the way to do it. And, I was very influenced by William Julius Wilson's work. And I think this is reinforced by Raj Chetty's recent work. Good jobs in a neighborhood or in a local labor market and getting more people into them has enormous leverage effects on everything about that neighborhood, everything about that local area. It affects the crime rate, it affects the whole atmosphere of the area, it affects school quality, everything else. And, so I think, personally, I think we need to think through at the local labor market level, the neighborhood level, how do we turn around the job situation for that local area? Again, housing is important, healthcare is important, all important, but if you don't turn around the good job situation, I don't think you can really address the problem.
This is a great segue to then turn to Adam's proposal a little bit further. So I think that there is, as you mentioned in your paper, there is a widespread sense that there are a lot of bad jobs in the American economy. And I wanted to go look for survey evidence, and I was really surprised by a Pew poll. I don't know if you saw it. From December of 2024, so at the end of last year, that found that 50% of all employed adults are extremely/very satisfied with their jobs, and only 12% are not too satisfied/not at all satisfied. And then when it digs deeper into this question of like, for the folks who aren't satisfied, what's going on, 82%, almost everyone is talking about their pay. The pay is not keeping up with the cost of living. And interestingly, 82% of people say that they feel respected by their employer, by their coworkers, and roughly 72% of people say they feel respected by their clients and their customers. This, I think, is a very different picture of jobs than I think we're used to hearing. And I wonder what evidence you're seeing that pushes back and says, actually, jobs are really bad, or are you looking at different kinds of metrics here?
I've never seen that poll before. That's fascinating. Maybe they were taking it at work.
Right in front of their employer, yeah. It's like those.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that the evidence that I think about when I look at surveys are, again, public support for unions, the percentage of people who say they would like to be in a union if they had the opportunity, and that is at historic highs in the United States. So maybe people are happy with their jobs and think they could be slightly better. I usually interpret the growing public support for unions as evidence that people are unhappy with their jobs. But thanks for bringing that to my attention.
Yeah, well, the reason I also bring this up too is because I think that on this panel we have like very innovative ideas for trying to push back on right-wing populism. But when you talk to people, the number one thing, especially in this last election we heard, was about inflation, right? And I wonder if there's actually, I mean, the Biden administration had focused a lot on trying to create good jobs when they were doing their industrial policy. Some people said maybe too much work was spent on that versus just trying to address inflation. So when you hear that, are you concerned about, do you think that that's something to maybe be more skeptical about trying to create good jobs versus we just need to bring down prices? That's the only thing people really care about.
I think I find the sort of like post-Biden administration soul-searching conclusion that the problems with the IRA, where it's slow implementation in terms of building things that take 4, 5, 6 years that won't be done before the next election. I've taken those to heart, and I think the need to do smaller things more quickly is a sort of growing consensus that I've been hearing here in DC, and I think some of that is still around a sort of Green New Deal perspective, where you push at the state level for solar panels on schools. I've got a friend who's been working on that at the local level, looking at state level green banks, advocating for those kinds of policies that are then built by unionized labor. And so you create the sort of same kinds of Green New Deal type coalitions, but at the local level rather than from the top down at the federal level. And then I think just in general, pushing for things that benefit workers and increase workplace safety at the state level to sort of demonstrate the ability of government to deliver, but at the local level, I think it's still a way forward, especially with gridlock and the sort of inability to do things at the federal level now.
And kind of going off of what you were saying earlier about unionization in the United States and the legal fixes that need to happen, what actually would need to happen to get us to the union density of a place like Sweden or other countries that see high numbers of folks in those kinds of jobs?
Pass the PRO Act, as Jamie and I like to end all of our essays by saying that is dead in the water now. But yeah, I mean, you need to stop employers from violating the labor laws that are on the books with impunity. Right? You have employers who think to themselves it's cheaper the union bust now, we probably won't get caught. Even if we do, it's a very small fine, sometimes years later, rather than dealing with a union. So I think changing labor law is the only way forward.
Great. Well, that is all of our time. I want to thank all of our panelists because they withstood my, my journalistic inquiries, but give them a round of applause.
All right, thank you for a terrific discussion, Jerusalem, Tim, Jamila, Chirag, and Adam. We are running a few minutes late, so bear with us as we have Samira Fazeli, Equitable Growth's board member, join us to provide some reflections from today.
Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm on Equitable Growth's board, but I'm also a former policymaker myself. I was in the Obama administration in the Treasury Department in the White House and the Biden administration in the White House. So one, I just want to express gratitude for everyone who wrote papers, for our speakers today, for such an engaging and lively discussion. Let's give them another round of applause. Our goal today at Equitable Growth was to give you the opportunity to think about how and whether economic trade-offs shouldn't necessarily be the sole focus of economic policymakers like myself, who have sat there and we've looked at the evidence and the data and tried to design really, really good policy, but we weren't always asked to also think about how democracy was implicated. Yes, because we worked for political actors, we thought about how party prospects were going to be implicated, but not necessarily how democracy itself was going to be implicated. And so I think today is a really important discussion to advance that conversation in the economic policy field. The second kind of objective today was, I think a through line you heard through all the papers and the panels was if we take democracy seriously, then we must center people's experiences of the economy as we formulate and implement that economic policy. And really, kind of doing away with the old dichotomy of people versus place-based policy and saying it kind of all matters and we have to work on all those fields at the same time. Equitable growth, we are here to provide evidence for a stronger economy. That is our tagline. What we really hope to be is a dynamic bridge that helps accelerate feedback loops between academia and policy, but what you saw today was also something a little bit different that we are now doing as well, where we're also bridging and working alongside movement groups. So we very intentionally had Sarah Nelson here from the unions. We very intentionally had Chirag here from Community Change, because we recognize that policy cannot be done on high up here in Washington. You have to be engaging with people who represent the citizens, who are not just elected leaders, or the institutions that organize people, so that we get policy that resonates. And what I wanted to ask folks to do is turn to your neighbor for a second. And I want to, well, first do a raise of hands. Did you learn something interesting today? All right. Did it spark any new ideas for you? Are there people you're going to connect with in the reception hall afterwards? And will you talk about how you're going to change anything? So I hope people spend a little bit of time in our hall there. If Melissa, we have that room still, right? And just talk to each other about what was your aha, what new action you're going to take. And I'll give you my only one aha because I know we're late on time. And it's I'm really holding this talk of American exceptionalism and the comparative perspective and how it helped us understand how broken our democracy is, like structurally broken our democracy is. As I look at other moments of economic populism in the US, they led to actual governance and institutional reforms in our democracy. So I'm really reflecting on what is our generation's charge going to be. You know, in different eras, it was civil service exams. It was direct election of presidents, not going through state legislatures. It was new agencies like the FTC or the CFPB just a decade or so ago. We need to have a real governance and reform agenda that isn't just about the what of policy, it's the how of policy. So that is my aha takeaway, but I hope folks turn to their neighbor and talk about what was your aha and what was your takeaway, because our goal here isn't just to have you learn the evidence and be like, that was interesting. It's faster feedback loops to direct that into new actions by everybody in this room. So Melissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Samira. And please join me in thanking the Equitable Growth staff who made today's event possible. Many of them are in the reception space, so be sure to shake their hands and thank them for the event. And also thank you to the staff of the National Union Building, including Dan here. As Alex mentioned, we have cards on the table in front of you all with the QR code, which will take you to the essay series. The first set of essays are up now, and a second set of essays will be released in the early fall. We will also be hosting another event on this topic in the fall in New York with Columbia University. So make sure you're signed up for Equitable Growth emails to get notified about it. We're eager to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation. So certainly, I hope that you talk with others in the other room there and keep the conversation going with us at Equitable Growth. And just want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed today's event.